One of the more famous Greek myths is one where the great and mighty Zeus, first among the gods, turns into a big old bird and gets busy with the queen of Sparta. Her husband, Tyndareus, king of Sparta, has to just roll with that, and very little time is spent examining why Queen Leda might have found a swan sexier than him. So now we've been talking about Zeus for less than 30 seconds, and we're already into bird-fucking, king-usurpin', demigod-birthin' territory. There are a lot of ways a person can approach Greek mythology, from the elevated intellectual approach of a classics major to the release-the-kraken nonsense of pop culture reimagining, like Clash of the Titans. Greek mythology serves its purpose for both, is the thing. Even in ancient Greece, it had the same dichotomy. The pantheon was at the heart of religious and philosophical discourse, but it was also at the heart of many a drunken conversation between regular folks, where the salaciousness, pettiness, and folly of both men and gods were the more pressing concern. Compared to the unfallible god of modern monotheism, the Greek gods were all tremendous shit shows, and it's that characterization of them as being more powerful than humans, but by no means better than humans, that's carried them along through so many twists and turns of history. It's no coincidence that the Art Deco movement of the early 20th century was somewhat obsessive with Greek iconography. We were expanding what the human animal was capable of doing, capable of being. Modernity was making gods out of all of us. Art Deco is an aspirational style, but the pessimism of the Greek gods is true there too. We had become more powerful, but we hadn't at all become any more just or good. The Greek pantheon can suit highbrow culture or lowbrow culture, optimism or pessimism. Because more than most religious figures, they are all so relatably fallible. Maybe not with the bird fucking, but in how short-sightedness, selfishness, and cruelty are major drivers of history, and how one bad turn can cause another, echoing down through generations. The God of War series of video games is a take on Greek mythology that latches on to the most pessimistic, sensationalistic parts of those myths, and then weaves them into a backdrop for an action puzzle platformer. I had heard a lot about God of War being childish or dumb or rooted in a kind of permanent middle school mindset, and sometimes the games can be, but after playing the whole original lineup, the PSP titles, the reboot, what surprised me the most was God of War's fidelity to the tone of the myths that it's riffing on. I think there's a reflexive instinct to think that classical subjects have to be treated with classical reverence. With God of War, that's not remotely the case. With God of War, the whole pantheon are at their dislikable worst. A bunch of entitled, bickering, scheming birdfuckers, the lot of them. And into this mix, we introduce Kratos, the ghost of Sparta, a new figure born from that spirit of spectacular, selfish dislikability. Kratos is a modern answer to an ancient question. If the gods are so terrible, why abide by them? In ages past, the world kicked our ass. God and nature could not be defied. Now, we live in an era of fracking, nuclear war, ocean acidification. We're our own gods now, and it's the world that we shape to suit ourselves, and we are equally as big of dumb shits about it as Zeus and his friends. Fate is for suckers. Obedience is for cowards. If the gods have done us wrong, then why do we lack the power to punish them? Right? Once things are set into motion, Kratos will take those events and that perspective far, far past its reasonable conclusion to a climax more extreme than anything else I've seen in games or movies or books dealing with Greek myths. God of War is a campy, grindhouse experience that takes the old myths and interrogates them in the most modern possible way. What's cleverest about God of War is how it's chosen this frame to support and intensify the most basic thing about itself. It's a button masher. The game's fun lies in sitting there and hammering out combo after combo, hour after hour. The original God of War is very deliberately kind of a contrarian riff on some of the tropes of the old Tomb Raider games, and it does quite a bit to distinguish one franchise from the other right away. Both would borrow artistic and thematic flourishes from antiquity and myth. Tomb Raider is past tense. God of War would be present tense. Both involve third-person platforming and timed puzzle solving. Tomb Raider was more abstract, more strategic, to the point of needing to hold down the shift key to walk Lara right up to the edge of a platform and line up a jump. It was a PC game more than a console one that way, slower paced, more complex in the control scheme. God of War leans into the real advantage of a controller over mouse and keyboard, which is a greater sense of immediacy. I've been a mouse and keyboard person all my life until very recently, and there's something just much more reflexive and tactile in the use of a controller over a mouse and keyboard. So, God of War's puzzles are much less about unlocking and pathfinding, and much more about instinct and impulse. You run, 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 and jump. Now! Oh, too bad. Try again. Tomb Raider's third-person camera was fixed to Lara. God of War's third-person camera is more environmental, panning around to make the most of every environment and to maximize the sense of scale. Tomb Raider's emphasis was on puzzles over action, where the action was often somewhat clunky. God of War's emphasis is strongly on action over puzzles, where its action is one of the smoothest and most enjoyable elements of the entire game. This is also where Kratos comes in as kind of a genius protagonist for this sort of experience. As a mythic figure, he can be supernaturally burly and aggressive. As a participant in a Grecian tragedy, he can follow the linear path provided to him and have that be thematically justified. As a fictional addition to the Greek pantheon, he can be just as much of a bastard as they were. So, when you, the player, are frantically smashing triangle, triangle, square, screaming, "Why won't you die?" and on-screen Kratos is also yelling and whipping his preposterous chain blades around in a literal whirlwind of violence, there is absolutely no disconnect. God of War is much less about plot than it is about impulse. This guy is on a hell of a rampage, and it feels fucking great. It reaches deep into the animal brain and keeps on hitting the big red buttons that say danger and triumph over and over for hours, like a drum solo at a Grateful Dead show. The animations are out of control in how fluid they are. The only times they aren't is during QuickTime events where the speed of the animation is tied to how quickly you're pressing the button. Furthermore, the Blades of Chaos, with their half-screen reach, keep you engaged with up to a half-dozen enemies at a time, maybe more, necessitating that the player have zero downtime between actions and combos. There's never a moment where you're threatened in just one single direction during combat. In this way, the play experience becomes narrative and characterization for Kratos. Who is he? He's the feeling of rage after the boss monsters killed you 12 times and you finally disembowel him on the 13th attempt. He's the underdog who fights against overwhelming odds. Hundreds and then thousands of blades and arrows line up against him, and they all go clattering down. He's the madman who delights in fountains of blood that erupt from enemies and the river of gore that flows over his sandals. I am all those things, too, in the play experience. This game got me seriously angry at it more than a few times, and I'm positive that that is how it wanted me to be. It wanted me, the player, to want the monsters as dead as Kratos, the protagonist, does. The lethality of its challenges makes triumphing over them feel meaningful, and the completely over-the-top approach to gore is one of the things that I often enjoy about horror media and action media in general. It lets us confront something heavy and sad and gross in a context where no one is really hurt and none of it means as much as it ought to. Real war? I never want to be in a position where I'm supposed to kill another person. In this particular, forgivingly cartoonish context, I am the chain-twirling, spell-casting, puzzle-solving God of War, and don't you forget it. When people try to make movies about video games, this is one of the biggest challenges. A good video game protagonist can excuse themselves from a lot of relatability or believability as a character if, mechanically, they can still sympathetically resonate with the player through the simple act of mashing the buttons. A lot of God of War's status as an all-time classic comes from how bold a production it was when it was first released in 2005. David Jaffe's Santa Monica Studios was given complete creative control over the title by Sony. Anytime a studio has a vision, a large budget, and no creative oversight, the result is usually pretty cohesive and worthwhile. In this case, it led to a kind of stem-to-stern tightness of production that often feels missing from a lot of modern titles, like the meandering open world of Days Gone, a modern PlayStation exclusive. In the first God of War, pretty much every encounter is handcrafted and somewhat unique, rather than the open-world approach wherein different interactive systems overlap to create more randomized, chaotic moments of play. The opening level does a huge amount to set the tone, pace, and scale of encounter for the rest of the game. With very little setup, the game places you with Kratos on the deck of a Grecian ship on a storm-tossed sea. Enemies immediately attack, not underpowered tutorial dudes, but the regular strength foot soldiers you'll be fighting for most of the rest of the game. They come at you in waves, dozens of them. No warning, no concession to lack of skill or coordination, just a ton of danger right away, and then escalating from there every level for the rest of the game. The first save point, not an automatic checkpoint, but the old-fashioned manual save waypoint style, is a solid 15 to 20 minutes of deathless play from the game's first fight, demanding that the player establish a solid baseline of competence before allowing them to really play the game. Today, that's common. Bloodborne and the Souls-likes all do that bigger, better, and more when it comes to using save points as a way of increasing the stakes of the action, but for 2005, this is kind of ahead of its time stuff. God of War's world is savage and mean. Its combat is demanding, heavy, and towards the end of the game, exhausting. Getting the players' dander up and making them hungry to challenge those demands is one of the game's strongest skills. The game rarely waits so long to provide a save point as it does the first time. That first time is for getting the player hooked on a feeling, the feeling of wanting to beat the systems, the game, the gods. The combat's the first part of the tutorial. Once you reach that first save point, the game gives you your first major puzzle, and it's one of the absolute worst in the entire franchise. You need to kick a destructible box across the ship's deck before the arrows from above kill you or destroy the box. Like many of the game's reflex-based puzzles, I had to try upwards of a dozen times to get it right. It's a mean-ass, touchy, bullshit excuse in timing, patience, and perseverance. Compared to this puzzle, little in the rest of the game, or the rest of the franchise even, is truly unfair, with a couple of extremely notable exceptions. Having this puzzle here at the very beginning is important, though. You can't ever say you weren't warned about how it's going to be, and if you can make it through this, you can make it through pretty much any other reflex puzzle that the game throws at you. Then, the third part of the tutorial, the boss monster, the Hydra. The boss fights are the most truly iconic part of God of War, not just this title, but as a whole franchise. This is where all the systems come together. They are both combat and puzzle at the same time, with a largeness of size and menace that dwarfs Kratos and anything else he encounters on a regular basis. For the Hydra, you have to survive long enough to damage one head, pin it with a falling spike, do that again to another head, and then impale its main head on the mast of the ship. Otherwise, it'll just regenerate in classic Hydra fashion. It is so much more fun than the puzzle before it, and so much more exciting than the combat before it. Plus, this is simply the level sub-climax, the first hour of the game. God of War has a tutorial level, more breathlessly exciting and meaningfully challenging than the very last levels of some lesser action titles. And I say that in 2019. In 2005, God of War was a game it was impossible to ignore. Unless you were a PC gamer like I was, I guess, in which case I found it pretty easy to ignore God of War for 14 years straight. But the thing was, I did miss out by doing it that way. Games have so much to say with presentation, narrative, thematic content, and I approach games most often from that perspective of how real I feel their worlds are, how well they articulate their imaginative elements. Getting into console gaming, I am coming to appreciate the mechanical aspects more. God of War taught me a lot about platforming, but it taught me much, much more than that about appreciating controls and physicality as a pillar of game design. When God of War does a QuickTime event, they randomize the inputs each time. There's no memorization, there's simply reaction. The symbol flashes, the thumb comes down. The less actual thought you put into it and the more reflexive it becomes, the more satisfying it actually is. It's funny to say all this because in 2005, this was a lot of my parents' argument for how I was wasting my time playing video games, that they were devoid of intellectual merit and operated solely in the realm of your lizard brain, leveraging very old fight-or-flight responses to hit your serotonin centers like a goddamn piñata. 14 years later, and my argument is not that this is untrue, it is completely true, but instead I argue that it's actually harder to trick the brain this way than you might think. There is serious craftsmanship that goes into something that uses light, sound, and a funny plastic remote control to make the brain feel like it's hunting or fighting or running, to take you off the couch and place you directly into these other wares. The first God of War is almost an ideal example of the kind of game an intellectual scold would use to paint the medium as classless, excessive, and devoid of cultural merit. At moments, it's all of these things. It's often hugely excessive in its gore and its masculinity and its stakes. It is sometimes totally classless, like a minigame where Kratos hops up onto the bed like a horny bunny and has a QuickTime event for banging. It takes the most salacious parts of Greek mythology and leaves out the philosophically intriguing points. It's about mashing buttons and reflex response. In 2005, thousands on thousands of teenagers sat in their living rooms driving swords into the mouths of minotaurs with their eyes glazed over, while thousands more parents hollered at them to turn that crap down from the kitchen. The thing is, a bad game doesn't do that. If a game can't hook you, your eyes never do glaze over, do they? The trick of turning a player into a couch zombie is not a fundamental function of video games. It's the mark of an especially good video game. Exactly how a good book will often use dust jacket quotes like, "I couldn't put it down," or "a real page-turner." Bingeable television is a thing streaming companies pay big money for. God of War was never part of high culture, but high culture can't be everything. Popular culture is popular because it resonates with people, often without them quite even knowing why. The thrill of high intellectualism is almost always contextual, seeing the big picture, putting a thing within its history, within its form, knowing what makes it different or special or unique. Take wine, I guess. It's knowing vineyards, vintages, and flavor profiles that wine people care about. The context. Popularly speaking, wine simply has to taste good to be good. You can put it in a bottle or put it in a box. The flavor is what matters, the experiential elements. I've always particularly enjoyed the eyes-glazed-over cliché about video games because of how fundamental a misunderstanding it is of what's going on. The judgment at play is that the brain is off. Nothing is going on. The game has made you a blank. This isn't the case when that happens to you. If the game has made your mind a blank, you turn the game off and you do something else. It's a bad game or a boring one. If you're so into a game that you don't notice or care about what's going on in the room around you, it's because your brain is so occupied and involved it simply doesn't have time for that shit. God of War hooks you in the extreme present tense, in the swing of blades, in the bursts of blood, in the shifting of danger from enemy to enemy. It never plateaus. It's a non-stop escalation from the deck of that boat to the top of Mount Olympus. What elevates God of War from good to great is more than just the fluidity and satisfaction of its combat animations and rhythms, though they constitute a large part of all of that. It's the omnipresent sense of spectacle. I mentioned the camera difference between God of War and Tomb Raider before, but it is a massive part of the game's personality across the whole franchise, too massive not to get more into. Without ever taking control away from the player, the camera can pan way out to best highlight a vista, it can pull tight to Kratos in a claustrophobic moment, it can do all the things a cinematic camera can do in a passive media environment to frame a shot while relying on the area of effect magic and unusually long reach of the Blades of Chaos to perpetuate the rhythms of combat and platforming no matter how the camera frames the moment, even if the frame changes while the combat is ongoing. A huge part of gameplay is even in what the camera doesn't frame. By doing things that challenge the given perspective, like running towards the camera or jumping down into what may appear to be a pit, sometimes the camera will adapt to that choice and reveal a little hidden something, most often a chest, but sometimes a bonus hall with a few different treasures. There's even an entire bonus room unlocked with 2 Muse keys that offers 25% more health and mana than Kratos would ordinarily be able to acquire. It's not hard to find either key. I did it without even really trying to, just by following my nose around the level. That's another major way God of War differentiates itself from Tomb Raider. Puzzles are usually contained to a single room or area, and secrets are often sniffed out and over in the span of about 30 seconds or so. Like everything else in the game, it's about impulse. To train the player to take their time combing everything over for some miscolored block or another would cause havoc with the pacing, the relentless forward-driving action. So the game's design instead rewards a more casual kind of interrogation of the space, just a feeling like there ought to be a few missing feet of hallway just outside of the frame, and it takes very little time and very little effort to test those hunches. Health and mana are upgraded by finding sets of hidden items, each time around for a quarter-bar boost. Your durability in the game literally depends on indulging this secret hunting behavior. What impressed me, though, is that they've hidden, across all difficulties, more of these items than you strictly need. You can miss 5 or 6 upgrade items and still be able to max your bars out. There's so much in this game that's designed to be aggressively cruel, but in this one particular area, they've given the player some critical slack. That's important because, more than skill with combat, which can be adjusted across many difficulties, the level design is fixed, and not everyone has an eye for that sort of thing. Puzzle design is bitterly pass-fail. It's also unaffected by the choice of difficulty level. Many of the puzzles are designed with an ideal solution in mind, a certain, very specific series of jumps or actions in an extremely short amount of time, with no space for fumbling. You get it 100% correct, or you die. There's a lot of prime examples, the most severe of which is going to be this late-game box puzzle. You gotta kick the box precisely 3 times and double jump off it with a confusing camera correction halfway through. You have to do this without losing a single second reorienting to the perspective shift. I was stuck here on this puzzle for so long that I found it easier to memorize a series of moves to glitch on top of the ledge you're trying to get to, rather than to solve the puzzle normally. I was also stuck for nearly an hour on this beam balancing puzzle, where you have to avoid spinning blades and maintain laser focus on your directional stick through 3 separate sets of twisting beams and rotating blades with no save point until you've cleared the whole set. Coming into any sort of casual contact with any blade kills you instantly by knocking you off, and a single errant twitch of the finger sends you off the side of the beam, and it takes so long to get back up that you're done for anyway. The blades are coming for you. Perfection or death. Nothing else will do. None of the other games in the entire franchise are quite as severe with their puzzles as here in the first game. Most don't even come close. It's a design that does work, though, for the theme they're going for. Kratos ought not to succeed. His quest should be doomed, but he does it anyway, even if the player has to die 100 times to get it right. The puzzles are the hardest thing in the entire game to overcome. The combat even helpfully offers to bump you down to easy if you get your ass kicked too many times in a row in a single room. If you're prideful, you can always refuse, but this game is a brutal-ass uphill battle, and if I'm dying every room on normal difficulty halfway into the game, I knew that I did not have a prayer for the late game if I didn't take the downgrade to easy mode. The upgrades, the combat, they have elements of forgiveness. The puzzles never do. It's a balance that makes for a truly challenging experience that offers enough rewards and enough lulls to make up for its sometimes intense frustrations. The environments escalate too. The Hydra and the sea give way to an Athens on fire, which is pretty good, but eventually you set out after Pandora's box, and then things seriously ramp up. It's at this point one of the most unique design decisions becomes clear. The entire game is a connected area. You'll set out from Athens through the desert and make that journey in a completely linear way, one foot after another. Even more impressive is that the dungeon which holds Pandora's box is this huge, massive area chained to the back of the Titan Kronos, who wanders with it through the wastes. While navigating the temple, it shakes and shifts along with the Titan as he moves, and there are vistas where you can look down over the Titan's shoulders to the desert floor below. Not to mention the fact that the temple comprises a third of the entire game, the middle third. There are 3 massive wings that have to be oriented to allow a beam to pass through and unlock a route to go even higher in the temple, where more deadly traps and more difficult challenges await. The imaginativeness of the environment is matched only by its cohesiveness. Once I unlocked the final architectural tumbler, I was stunned by how well all its massive, disparate pieces ended up fitting together into the true path. It's a labyrinth in the most outrageous, impossible of ways. The pacing of a myth or a movie would get completely bogged down by hours of combat and puzzles, one after another, after another, after another, after another. But video games exist so much in the present tense that these things accumulate into the whole without a player much realizing that it's happening. I mean, sure, after a while there's a certain feeling of being exhausted by the scale of the dungeon, but that is also the thrill. It's an impossible space, utterly unrealistic, but tonally consistent with the excess of everything else in the game, so it barrels past believability with ease. There's a trapped soul outside advising you that every mortal to try and test the dungeon has died. The whole structure, every hour you spend in it, is a one-shot attempt to stop you from doing what you're doing right now. If you retrieve Pandora's box, then the whole temple becomes a useless, spent thing. So, even in the non-violent elements of progression, Kratos is doing damage and bringing things to their end. It's a spectacular kind of mythic fatalism, the one right person at the right place designed for this singularly destined encounter. The dungeon has a personality to it that's just bursting at the seams, and its difficulty runs along such a rapidly escalating curve that beating it, fulfilling that singular destiny, is about as memorable a gaming moment as I've ever had, even playing 14 years after its release. So, how to top it? By killing Kratos, of course. Ares, the god of war, tosses a mast-sized spear all the way from Athens and pins Kratos to the temple doors right in his moment of greatest triumph. It's a fantastic way to pivot immediately away from victory to further danger. Now Kratos falls into Hades itself. Souls rain from the ceiling into an ocean of blood. Kratos claws his way onto the fleshy platforms floating above the blood ocean. Figures continue to rain down from above. It's just about the most goddamn metal thing on the PlayStation 2. The puzzles are also impossibly gnarly in this segment, and it is a massive segment, a huge environment. You go through many, many phases of hell, each nastier and meaner than the last. That box-kicking room is here, along with many more beam-balancing puzzles and a pillar of rotating blades that is just absolutely fucking devious to solve. Devious, but not entirely unfair or impossible. Although I vastly prefer doing the puzzles in later titles, there's no denying that these buttons stick out in my mind more than what came after. It's not just the huge amount of time I spent trying to solve some of them, it's the wonder and appreciation for the sick son of a bitch who came up with them. They're grueling and maddening when you're doing them, but when you're through and can appreciate the how of it, it's hard not to admire the craft of them. Most games these days want you to be able to see the end. This first God of War dares you to quit. When you clawed your way out of hell, you open Pandora's box, grow to the size of a skyscraper, and fight Ares with a sword that was formerly an environmental object. It's quite a long time coming, too. The motivation's teased out in cutscene flashbacks throughout the game. Kratos, a long time ago, was up north fighting the Gaul, being a soldier when he was defeated by the barbarian king. Ares came to him and offered to turn the tide of battle in exchange for his everlasting soul. Like any devil's bargain, that has some complications further down the line. Kratos was goaded into killing his own wife and child, and their ashes now coat his body in white. His fight with Ares, then, is very, very personal. Later games will continue to fixate on, draw out, and revisit this story, but here in the first title it takes all game long to sprinkle the backstory in, allowing the sub-climaxes, like finding Pandora's box or climbing out of hell, to take narrative priority. So many of the ups and downs the player experiences over the course of the game are mechanical and environmental. The narrative payoffs build slowly and steadily until the game is ready for them, and then it makes them as epic as anything else. See them here, as tall as buildings, the ocean coming up only to their ankles, absolute balls-out Clash of the Titans shit. Everything loops around, from the opening seconds of the intro cinematic to Kratos' personal history to the ocean on which you mashed your first button. Closing the loop so emphatically and tightly is what makes the climax really work. It seems impossible to take it any further than that, and then it does. An epilogue that has you running Kratos up the golden steps to the top of Mount Olympus, where he becomes the new god of war. While the credits hinted Kratos will return, the first game didn't seem to envision itself as part of a franchise or series very much. It escalates the way it does because ascending to godhood actually is the final possible plateau in most story circumstances. The final cutscene, for example, talks about how, for the rest of eternity, Kratos would guide any hand who picked up a sword or a gun. There's a suggestion that Kratos, as god of war, changed things, that the increasing brutality of war into the modern era was partly because of how indiscriminately bloodthirsty he was. He's a collateral damage kind of guy. It's become a collateral damage kind of world. It's a notable tone shift because, while it is triumphant in some way, for the player at least, it also casts Kratos as a force of evil, an extremist of sorts, not just a wronged man out for revenge. This is also the split path that lies ahead for Kratos, generally speaking. To be something different, he would first have to become something lesser. He's no longer a man now, he's a god. He's part of what he's hated, and in many ways, he's been the subject of his own hatred ever since the day he killed his family. Sure, Ares arranged the situation, but Kratos swung the blades. He always swings the blades. That's who he is. That's what makes him the god of war. His first impulse is violence, and that pretty much always works, so he never tries anything else. He's rage personified. Within this single game, his rage is focused, contained, and then left to fester over the millennia in an epilogue. To keep going with an actual, direct, participatory narrative arc, I guess you'd have to take that rage to an even more extreme conclusion than godhood. God of War 2 is an even better game than the first. It's not a very different game, but it has a laser-sharp understanding of why the first was so enjoyable and how to top itself by degrees. David Jaffe stepped down as creative lead, and Cory Barlog, lead animator, stepped up. Barlog would from then on become the creative custodian for much of the franchise, from writing the scripts of the PSP prequels to crafting the rebooted God of War when the time came for the series to pivot or die. God of War 2 was one of the last major titles released for PlayStation 2, coming out in early 2007 after the PlayStation 3 was already released. It was an interesting choice that I think may have actually contributed to the popularity of the game rather than detracting from it. There's always a high cost barrier to entry for any new console generation. People simply had more PS2s than PS3s. The PS3 was less than 6 months old on the market. By pushing the PS2's hardware to its limit, by making the older system sing as sweetly as it could one last time, God of War 2 was at the apex of memorable visuals for the PlayStation 2 and would stay there, more or less permanently. The PS3, Xbox 360 era has a completely different kind of 3D aesthetic than the older platforms. Keeping God of War 2 within the older system's look and feel also kept it more artistically cohesive with the previous title. I'm used to high-fidelity modern graphics, but God of War's art, architecture, and background skyboxes are so well done and have such a painting-like quality to them that I found myself dropping my jaw some and muttering a little wow anyway, despite their low-res graphics. God of War 2 is a masterclass in creating a robust sense of a broader environment in a linear game. God of War 1 was compact, tight. God of War 2 is a much more sprawling, truly mythic experience. It begins with the friction between Kratos and the rest of the Pantheon. To put it simply, Kratos is not enough of a human to fit in. His rage is unquenchable. He longs for neither power nor wealth. All he wants is eternal revenge. So, having killed Ares, he's in a bit of a post-godhood funk. Kratos has backed the armies of Sparta as they ravage the rest of Greece. Zeus has decided to stop Kratos and the Spartans at Rhodes before they completely destroy the land. You begin with most of your top-level powers of the last game, your bars maxed out as Zeus shrinks you to mortal size and tries to fight you with the Iron Colossus. Again, here we have a first level more exciting than many games' climaxes. It's also a direct continuation from the last game in terms of power and spectacle both. It's only after an hour or more of fighting the Colossus that Zeus comes down to offer Kratos a gift of sorts, the Blade of Olympus, a big old sword with tremendous power. When Kratos picks it up, it drains his godhood from him. Zeus stabs him, and Kratos goes tumbling down to hell again. It takes little time this time to claw your way back out, but down there he meets Gaia, the exiled titan who's narrated much of the story so far. She asks him to rebel against the gods, to free the titans, and to set them against the gods for a new crack at an old war. There's just one little thing in the way. Fate itself. So mechanically, it's a full reset, down to a stub of health, no magic, no skills, just a massive grudge. In terms of the stakes of the game, though, we're going to keep going with the escalation. The enemy this time is no mere god, but the natural order itself. The environments of the game are much larger, much more outdoor-oriented. Not just the vast, featureless desert of the first game, but somewhere even more strange and secretive, the Island of Creation. It's an island that's functionally one single, slowly unlocking dungeon, like the temple that held Pandora's box in the previous game. It takes some time to wind up to that, though. First, you've got to conspire with another titan who actually knows where the island is, and then get on the back of your trusty Pegasus to get there. Oh yes, it is time for horse aerial combat minigames. This is a lot of the brilliance of something like God of War 2. It's doing with action what a movie like Airplane might be doing with jokes. It's trying every absurd thing it can think of in as rapid of a succession as possible, so that if you're enjoying one thing, it's easier to enjoy the next thing, and if something loses you, well, just wait 30 seconds for something entirely different. The Pegasus sequence is completely unnecessary, unexpected, and unforgettable. Kratos just goes ahead and rolls with it with the same utilitarian scowl that he greets everything else with, and the player hasn't got any other time to say anything besides yeehaw, I guess, as they saddle up for a sky showdown. You'll eventually get into an extended boss battle up there, one of the more ridiculously choreographed fights I've seen in an action game. And this guy is just a throwaway boss. The whole sequence up here is just an excuse to watch Kratos do all this ridiculous mid-air combat. Since you don't have your regular attacks and your regular range of motion, it's mostly done via QuickTime events. These days, QTEs are a little out of fashion. It's God of War's stylish application that made them a fad in the first place. The idea is that these spectacular monsters deserve spectacular deaths, something more fluid and cinematic than the player's clumsy inputs can manage, even if the player input combos are animated with an incredible skill. A cutscene is not interactive enough. God of War might have plenty of cutscenes, but they're only used for exposition. QuickTime events are a compromise. You're responding along with Kratos, not directly controlling him, and your inputs need to be rhythmic to the animations. That rhythmic input is enough to fool you into feeling like you're helping, even if all you're doing is allowing the animation to continue uninterrupted. The randomization of inputs and the extremely slim time window given to the player to hit the buttons makes it feel so urgent that the urgency completely bypasses the fact that it's an element of play roughly independent from skill. Plus, it's always at the climax of damaging a creature in a more direct, player-controlled way. It's that final sprint to the finish where both of your mortalities are neck and neck and the camera bulbs are flashing. Of course, the game's also got another sex minigame, this time much more ridiculous in the spirit of escalation in which the whole franchise follows. If you break down a barrier during the Siege of Rhodes, with the war on and everything, Kratos can invite himself into a hot tub with two busty ladies who babble VHS-era porno come-ons. The camera pans to a statue of a cherub taking a piss, and you have to respond to button prompts that become increasingly suggestive as you rub your joysticks in little circles and quickly tap buttons in rhythm with the video girl fake sex noises. There's a lot of criticisms about sexism lobbed at God of War, and as things drag on in the franchise, there's more and more merit to those arguments, but early on here, the whole thing is just so absolutely over the top and deliberately juvenile that I don't see any way to read it as a legitimate attempt at titillation. It's a joke, where the setup is being goaded into increasingly stupid QuickTime prompts, and the punchline is that you actually went along with it. I'm sitting there, twiddling as directed, and thinking this has got to be the goddamn dumbest gaming moment of my life, and then later realizing that was the intent. That if the developers were right there at that moment, they'd just be laughing and saying, yeah, it is, it's pretty stupid, while giving each other casual low fives. Most of the time, these QuickTime events are meant to make the player feel badass, but in this particular case, it's meant to make you feel like a little bit of a dumbass instead. It's a major piece of evidence in the argument that says that the God of War games are just cheese trash. The moment certainly qualifies as cheese and trash, but I think it's an interesting little window into what works and what doesn't when it comes to QTEs as a whole kind of general thing. That it could be so effective in conveying the impression that there's something rude and crude going on when all you're really looking at is a peeing cherub. Plus, as dumb as that is, as base the impulses that the game indulges are, it's still a sophisticated work in many areas. Its visual art is just one of those arenas. The level design of the Island of Creation is where the game is at its most complex. The whole thing is a puzzle box and not a playground, in contrast to an island map like the first Far Cry had. When you first arrive, you've got to prime the system by unleashing the Steeds of Time, a trio of gigantic horse statues who, after an hour or so's puzzling and fighting, do begin to gallop into a new position and extend the wings of the dungeons behind. There's a great cohesion to each step of that process, each part of the island. The only clean break comes when you've gone beyond the main temple and the swamps and come across a columned walkway from one canyon's edge to the other. It's unstable and begins to collapse just about the moment you set foot on it, leading to a breathless sequence of timed jumps. It's an example of improved puzzle design in the second game. Even though I had to try a good half a dozen times to get it right, it was exciting each time, and the timing that I had to follow was well telegraphed by the environment. The puzzles are easier this time around, but I have a hard time imagining that many people will mistake the greater margins of forgiveness for weaker design. Rather than learn and execute a certain pattern of actions and inputs absolutely perfectly, a little leeway increases the likelihood that a player will get it right when they first encounter it, or soon after, letting the momentum of action continue to build without awkwardly falling off the edge of the screen every 30 seconds in a difficult puzzle. The puzzles are fewer locked rooms and more active actions with the environment. Though when the game does do locked rooms, it does them with style. Here, for example, you reach the High Temple of the Fates only to find it time-locked, an appetizer puzzle before the main puzzle of finding your way out of the room. The solution isn't about twitch reflexes, but careful study of the environment and letting curiosity be your guide. There's a few hidden chests in the room as well, if you align the upper beams to where they face out of the frame diagonally and then jump backwards off of them toward the camera. Experimentation is a major part of any puzzle-solving game, but in the original God of War, that probing to find a solution was often very fatal. Here, that kind of death happens much less often. Instead, they've made the mechanisms of the puzzles more complex, made the picking of the great and ancient locks more important than the anxiety of fatal consequence. God of War 2 differentiates better between what's a puzzle and what's a trap. The traps are as murderous as they've ever been, but they're so much shorter than they were before. Take that beam balancing act with the spinning blades in the first game. Is that a puzzle or a trap? It's kind of an unfair, too long blend of the two, if you ask me. The rhythm here is improved greatly by having puzzles act as brief rest zones, a time to relax and let the tension ebb before the next wave of monsters and the next set of murder spikes. The Island of Creation gets more and more surreal as you approach the end as well. The final Temple of the Fates is a beautiful, impossible thing, grand and inhuman, not meant for a mortal. That we can be this many hours deep into the series and still be escalating the art, the combat, everything, is a hell of a thing. But the combat, the style, and the nefarious architecture still have a long way to go yet before they begin to grow stale. There's a steady, significant shift into seeing Kratos as a villainous character as well, and that is where he fits best into the setting. God of War 1 had elements of that cruelty. You could kill innocents for health orbs, and at one point you solve a puzzle by roasting a fellow Spartan alive. But from the very beginning of the second game, Kratos is bad fucking news. He's killing Greece, literally killing it, with the armies of Sparta who benefit from his divine favor. The gods are terrible, yes, but there's no constructive element in Kratos' quest for revenge, no plan for an afterwards, just rage. Pure, impulsive rage. People are absolutely terrified of Kratos. Except for the hot tub ladies, I guess. And why not be terrified? He's become exactly what he hated. Even if Zeus stripped him of his powers, he's still no mortal. Late in the game, there's a very cool, very short boss fight, all done in shadow against a mystery figure. The figure is quick and skilled, a worthy opponent. When the light reveals what you've done, you find that Kratos has killed the most loyal of his Spartan generals, someone who may have been an actual friend to Kratos in his old soldiering days. Zeus, as punishment for what Kratos did, has destroyed the Spartan nation, killed them to a man. This soldier came to do what Kratos is doing, roll back time and fate, because the world right now is ruined and lost. Already, just the second game in a 7-game franchise, Kratos' addition to the Pantheon has broken history. Many of the bosses you face throughout the game are mythic figures, like Perseus, whose personal myth is also the plot to Clash of the Titans. Every figure that Kratos encounters dies, often quite horribly. For example, there's an incredible quick-time event where you steal the wings of Icarus right off his back while the two of you tumble down an abyssal trench towards hell. You fall so deep that you have to ask Atlas to let you out again, though he is helpfully inclined to do so since you're on a Titan's errand anyway. Every time Kratos encounters some element of Greek myth, that element becomes tainted or destroyed. In the Temple of the Fates, there are 2 scholars who must translate tomes that allow Kratos access to the Fates themselves. Part of that ritual is that the translators must be sacrificed. Their blood is part of the key. Kratos is more than happy to indulge them in that. You, the player, must beat these scholars half to death, and then fully to death, to force them to read the full passage and fulfill their part in Kratos' personal destiny. It's sad, it's mean, and since the scholars know full well what Kratos is doing, this will mean the end of all things, including their lives. All these traps, all this combat, it was try to stop you individually from doing specifically what you're doing now, like the temple that held Pandora's box, but with even larger supernatural stakes. The Fates themselves make up a pretty spectacular series of boss fights, the first 2 Fates being mostly a combat puzzle, and then the third Fate being an environmental one due to the Fates' grotesque size. These boss fights also figure somewhat into the feeling that the early God of Wars are a bit on the sexist side, since all the femininity there is in the game is either in those traditional standards of beauty attracted to the main character by default that you saw earlier, or else some kind of big-titty monster lady. One of the Fates even hits on him a bit. It's prominent enough to draw some side-eye, but I feel like the primary motivation with the Fates was grotesque monster design in a general kind of way, and not really a deliberately gendered one. The Fates and the Muses are women in the myth, so they're women here. It is a monster designer's job, after all, to make their audience feel a little uncomfortable, which the game happily does in a myriad of ways. For God of War 2, the intention seems to land on straightforward grotesquerie. It's something the game is awfully good at. It is good at being gross. God of War 1 didn't leave very much slack for further sequels to escalate from, but the second game has a much clearer understanding of how much farther it wants to go and spends much of its climactic energy setting up plot threads instead of resolving them. After taking the windows of fate into your own hands and finding the passage to the moment Zeus struck you down in Rhodes, Kratos strides right on through to pick up the conversation where it was last left off, with the Sword of Olympus lodged in Kratos' chest. I expected a big deal boss fight, and you kinda get one, but that was mostly the Fates' job. To defeat Zeus, you mostly have to do a quick-time event. It just happens to be the worst quick-time event I've ever played in anything. This stems from a determination to make it a climactic quick-time event, harsher and more finicky than any other implementation of the mechanic in the game. Zeus is supposed to be stronger, smarter, and faster than Kratos, so how do you convey that with choreographed button mashes? Well, first, God of War 2 has generally, up until now, been excellent at suggesting when a prompt would flash if the player was watching the animations during the QTE. With Zeus, he's tricky. The button prompts occur the split second before Zeus does something so that Kratos can counter. Second, the time allowances to meet the prompts have been trimmed to their barest minimums. Even on the lowest difficulty setting, it has to be an immediate twitch reaction. If you've taken the time to think about which symbol is where on the gamepad, you've already lost. Third, it's an endurance run. Even once Kratos has turned the tide on Zeus and begins to kick his beardy old ass, any hesitation to button mash will mean that Zeus gets to counter himself and instantly kill Kratos. What's more, each time you die, the same 30 seconds of banter between the two of them plays again before you get a chance to try again with the button mashing. It took me nearly 36 attempts, which means I listened to the same 30 seconds of dialogue for 15 full minutes. When Kratos goads Zeus with, "Free me from this torment!" boy howdy did I agree. A QuickTime event, used right, allows for moments of action way beyond the verbs of regular play, but the intention is always to make the scene feel interactive, even when it is all scripted. To craft a QuickTime event so twitchy as this runs the risk of trapping a player in a scene, to the point where the scene loses all dramatic weight and its interactivity barely registers. I had to set the game down for a night and come back to it again in the morning because I got so damn mad at being stuck in this loop. I saw every death animation at every stage of each button prompt in the sequence. Of course, there's the counter-argument that I should just get good, but this is the narrative climax, and it can't function correctly as the end of the game when it's experientially closer to a record skipping at the crescendo of a song. Once past it, though, Kratos continues down his path to vengeance at all costs. It costs him, this game, Athena, the only one of the gods who actually cared for him. She throws herself on his sword rather than let him kill Zeus. To kill Zeus is to destroy Greece. Surely Kratos knows this. And he does. He simply doesn't care. In one reading, this is meant to motivate him further for revenge, that this is Zeus's fault somehow that Athena died. But it's more plain to see that Kratos has become more or less completely unhinged. His violence and rage can only get worse until it reaches a terminal point for either Greece or him or both. The game ends on a true cliffhanger and a fantastic image. Kratos clinging to the back of tree-covered Gaia as the Titans defy the now broken bonds of fate and attack Olympus to seek revenge on the children who imprisoned them for so long. God of War 3 will pick up directly from that image in that moment, but before that there was another major God of War release, a prequel for the PlayStation Portable called Chains of Olympus. Today, the Switch is so omnipresent that it's hard to imagine a world without high-definition handhelds. 2005, though, was a brief transition era where mobile technology was suddenly everywhere, but the coolest phone you could probably have was a Razr flip phone, unless you were some Mr. Moneybags with a BlackBerry. When the PSP released, packing the graphical fidelity of a whole PS2 in the space of a movie theater-sized Mr. Goodbar, it was a major visible step forward in consumer technology. In high school, I remember that having a PSP was definitely one of those things that drew attention anytime anyone happened to break one out. Chains of Olympus was designed for the PSP with the express purpose of bringing the sense of scale and spectacle that the PS2 games were known for to the tiny screen of the handheld. Chains of Olympus is shorter, easier, and simpler than its PS2 predecessors, but the thing that's enduringly impressive about it is how its environments and boss battles feel no smaller for the change of systems. Later on, the PSP titles were re-released for PlayStation 3, which were then much later put on the game streaming service PS Now, which is how I encountered them now. A PSP game ported to PS3, played remotely on PS4 via emulation. My point being, it's kind of neat that I could play them at all, considering how completely history has passed the PSP by. There were people who bought whole movie libraries on its proprietary UMD mini-disc system, and those people are now essentially a new generation of folks who have a cardboard box full of Betamax tapes. So, all the footage you see here of Chains of Olympus, and then later Ghost of Sparta, unless you're watching this on a phone or a tablet or a Switch or what have you, is gonna look a little murky and a little stretched. When considering the art and visuals, I did try to take into account how it would be shrunken onto a tinier display natively. What's noteworthy is that even stretched the way it is onto a big living room TV, the fidelity is not hugely different from the PS2 titles. God of War 2 is grander than either this or the other PSP spin-off, but there are moments that certainly challenge the first God of War in terms of spectacle and grandeur. A separate studio, Ready at Dawn, did the vast majority of work on the PSP titles, yet they completely nailed the texture and feel of the franchise as a whole. These games don't feel like spin-offs. They feel like little lost chapters of the primary games. Plus, these games are quite playful with the familiarity they expect series fans to come in with. Very early on in the first level, you balance across a short, straight beam, and the game gives you an achievement for completing all the beam puzzles in the game. It's an achievement being used as an explicit, tongue-in-cheek apology for some of the first game's more frustrating moments. The only letdown is that the puzzles in the game are often too simple and too forgiving, more so than the combat this time. The difference seems to be in how the PS2 titles have a lot more vacuum space in their levels. You can jump off nearly anything and fall to your death in dozens and dozens of ways. Here in the PSP games, invisible walls are everywhere. Except in situations where falling is designed as a specific hazard, the game has shaved out all of these non-spaces. If there is a long drop or gap or hole in the level, then it's cheaper with the system resources to simply show it and not usably map it. Inadvertently, this leads to the game having a much more casual feel to it, like using the things that prevent you from getting gutter balls at the bowling alley. It's not nearly as mean or nasty of a game world either, which gives surprising leeway in painting Kratos as a little less of a mean and nasty guy himself. There's not a lot of redeeming Kratos in the present tense of the story, but if we go back before the events of the first game, he's at least more of a warrior and less of a supernatural harbinger of death. The game takes an awfully long time to ramp up, beginning with a kind of straightforward and really unimaginative defense of a city against a Persian army who have a giant basilisk with them. It is a good way to warm up to the control scheme, though, but it's nothing so striking as the opening levels of the PS2 titles. Then, the game shifts dramatically to the Temple of Helios, crashed out of the sky and surrounded by the toxic black dream clouds of Morpheus. You've got to rally the steeds and put it back in the sky. The Temple of Morpheus is high on puzzles, but lean on plot. And frankly, that's fine. I imagine that imitating the mechanical texture of the original games on a handheld was a more immediately impressive achievement than any sort of digression of plot. The PSP did not have the twin joysticks like the TV console systems did, so the control scheme here is pulled in a little tighter. Getting the player used to the difference would necessarily have to be a design goal. The Temple of Helios is a really gorgeous, dreamlike environment of gold and white marble. It's got plenty of chests hidden just out of frame, but the smaller general size of the maps, both internally as a labyrinth and externally as a connected environment, mean that those chests aren't hidden as deeply or complexly as they used to be in the previous games. A lot of their solutions seem kinda obvious. Since every effort was made to replicate the feel of the game's predecessors, I'm pretty sure that this is more of a hardware concession and not a failure of the mapper's imagination. The game even replicates the spiral staircase camera shot that comes to be kind of a franchise signature, present in every game. When the temple flies again, Kratos doesn't take it to the sky like he's supposed to, but down into Hades to unravel a plot between the goddess Persephone and the titan Atlas. The level design just keeps getting more and more interesting the more supernatural and surreal it gets. One of my favorite side characters in the franchise is down here, Charon the Ferryman. He's whimsically creepy in the best of ways, and the game does this clever build-up where you test yourself against him once in a circumstance where he cannot lose, and then again with a new power that absolutely mops the floor with the snide old bastard. Small, self-contained arcs of achievement and advancement, even here in a spin-off that's like a maximum of 5 hours long. For the most part, the boss fights are really excellent. A little bare bones in terms of environmental detail, but rich and intricate in the animations, with strategy and attack patterns and all the hallmarks of a high-budget boss monster. The QuickTime events are fluid, they're vicious, and they're just as engaging as they've ever been. They're just not quite as epic. At least there is nothing quite as dumb as the extra hot tub minigame. No, the novelty QuickTime event of Chains of Olympus is way weirder and way more memorable. Across the whole franchise, Kratos' perception of himself as a father is what comes to kind of define the human parts of his character. It's pretty straightforward in the first two games. He's real angry about having been tricked into killing them. But beyond that, there's really not much of a sense that he would have actually preferred family life to one of warfare and death. Chains of Olympus is no less melodramatic than the games have been before, but it is melodramatic in a broader range of ways than before, which is progress. The setup is that Persephone, goddess of the underworld, has a plot to let the world fall from Atlas's shoulders, destroying the Grecian world and its gods in one fell swoop. Since Kratos is still serving the gods, he is fate-bound to stop it. The thing is, the very next game in the franchise in release order, God of War 3, has a plot where Kratos does exactly the same thing, pretty much. He conspires with the Titans, and God by God kills the world. It's a strange kind of ironic dissonance between the active plot and the self-contained prologue plot. It helps paint Kratos here as being significantly less terrible than he'll later become, but it muddies the waters by having Persephone be a more sympathetic villain than even Kratos is when she details her scheme. It's no more than the myth that she was forced into her marriage and is only permitted to see the surface world for a scant few months of the year. In Greece, Persephone was a harvest goddess, waxing and waning with the crops. In God of War, the game looks at her story in the same modern way it has been, imagining who Persephone would be, not if she abided by fate, but if she mocked it and took some of the vengeance that she's well earned. Destroying the whole world all at once seems cruel and excessive, but you end up doing it by degrees in God of War 3 anyway. It's an interesting parallel that makes it almost disappointing that the climax of Chains of Olympus is to just beat the snot out of Persephone and Atlas both. The fact that Persephone's scheme disrupts and destroys the supernatural fabric of the world also takes the sting out of what would otherwise be a very strong bit of storytelling. All game long, Kratos is taunted by hints that the spirit of his daughter Calliope is calling to him from somewhere. Persephone makes that call possible. Kratos willingly strips himself of magic and health to make Elysium accessible. Calliope is there. They can be father and daughter again. This is a conundrum from Kratos that I would be curious to see resolved without a catch or a constraint, if he would actually willingly give up on power and give up on violence forever to be with the family he ruined. As it is, it's not really much of a choice, at least not that choice. Persephone straight up tells him that Elysium will be destroyed unless he spurns Calliope and fights. If he stays, they all become nothing. So it's not so much of a choice between war and family, but one where choosing family is choosing war. And that's much less interesting. The game has got to be consistent with its timeline, sure, but this was a clarifying moment, downgraded to a moment of peculiar novelty. Peculiar because they made a minigame out of leaving Calliope. You have to turn her away with rapid button mashes, like parrying an attack in other QuickTime events, 3 times in a row as she hugs him tighter and demands that he stay. When Kratos does pull free, he starts to tear innocent souls apart to replenish the precious, precious blue and green orbs that he earlier gave up. By fate and necessity, nothing has changed, and Kratos fights against a goddess who fundamentally shares his vision. Chains of Olympus is a truly fantastic, small-screen adaptation of all the mechanical, rhythmic, and stylistic elements of God of War. Its only real drawback is how the storytelling is chained to the angrier, crueler Kratos. Without that element of cruelty, however, God of War 3 wouldn't be the game that it is. It's an action game that feels tangibly unlike any other I've ever played, including previous Gods of War and the upcoming Gods of War. The basics of interaction are essentially unchanged from previous titles. The feel of moving Kratos and swinging the Blades of Chaos is as rewarding as it's ever been. Maybe a little better, but in smaller ways instead of larger ones. No, what's special about God of War 3 is how it uses scale, of landscape, of monster, and of intention, to create a feeling of bleak, nihilistic inevitability. It flips the script on most action games by having you play the villain and destroy the world, sure, but it also continually reminds you that Kratos is barely a mote of dust in the eyes of the gods and the titans. In every meaningful way, Kratos is the underdog, literally dwarfed by his opponents. And yet, over the course of the game, is a building sense that Kratos can't do anything but win, that this small person will be the undoing of a gigantic machine, no matter what god or monster stands against him. God of War 3 incorporates Kratos' story, his personal story, more explicitly into the mythology of Olympus than ever before, and the world is littered with references to past in-game events and confrontations. All of these suggestions lead to the same conclusion, that Kratos, the ghost of Sparta, brings misery and death on unheard-of scales. The hardware swap from PlayStation 2 and the PSP to the PlayStation 3's radically more powerful capabilities allow the games to escalate immediately and creatively from even where God of War 2 left off by allowing for levels spatially much larger and more intricate than before. In God of War 2, the Titan army that scaled Mount Olympus was a pre-rendered cutscene. Here, it's the opening level and all its seamless, loading screen-free, fully interactive glory. God of War 3 is pretty clearly designed with 2 audiences in mind. The franchise fans who will see all the little nods and references, and the newcomers who might not know anything about Kratos at all. The game's story and presentation is just as strong either way. Who Kratos is as a character and how Kratos feels when you're mashing out combos and disemboweling minotaurs are, here in this title more than any other, the exact same thing. A breathless, manic, preposterously aggressive drive to overcome every challenge ahead of you, no matter how bleak things get, no matter how many indications you get that you should probably stop. The animations are more beautifully fluid than before, too, and the new side weapons are more useful. There is, straightforwardly, more art and more tactical variety to the combat. Kratos has never presented himself better, and, critically, there is no build-up to any of this. The game starts you off with most of the powers, artifacts, and status bars a player would have ended God of War 2 with, just as that game started you off at maximum power in its opening level. You've even still got the Blade of Olympus, which you spent all damn game trying to get your mitts on last time around. If you've played this series in order, it's a seamless transition from God of War 2 to 3, and a highly rewarding start. If this is your first experience with Kratos, then your first hour getting to know the guy sees you pitting yourself against Poseidon and prevailing. Not just prevailing, kicking his watery ass all up and down the street with more verve and more style than a lot of the digital action even in the 2010 Clash of the Titans remake. It's difficult to start an action game off on a stronger foot than that. It's an attempt to recreate the magic of the first game's opening level, a nostalgic intention which is often a fool's errand. In this case, though, it's such a dramatic difference between what it's possible to portray in a game between 2005 and 2010 that there's room to be drawn in the exact same way all over again. It's this brilliant hook of using Climax's introduction that cinches it. Structurally, the first level is much the same as it was in 2005. The first save point is a long way away from the beginning, and the difficulty begins at a very aggressive baseline. One thing that's missing is a tricky, annoying puzzle, because those have been streamlined out of the game pretty much entirely. The platforming is altogether more forgiving and more accessible than it's ever been, part of a concession to new audiences, which improves pacing noticeably, but does take away some from the overall feeling of the world being arbitrarily mean and cruel. The focus is much more on spectacle than on twitch reflex, so the navigational novelty is the overarching battle itself. Kratos leaps from Titan to the halls of Mount Olympus, back again. The level itself, the literal ground you walk on, is alive in ways that are wildly creative and very novel. Even when you pop inside the mountain for some more traditional level design, it presents you with spectacles like the corpse of Ares, preserved in a frozen tomb and only vaguely visible through the wavy ice. In a Gamasutra retrospective, senior producer Steve Caterson said, quote, "The very first thing the tech guys did was they ported the God of War 2 engine to the PlayStation 3. Very quickly, we were able to play the PlayStation 2 game on the PlayStation 3, which meant that Kratos could move around. He could jump, he could run, slice his blades, do all of his combos and animations, and he could fly. All of the things that he could do in God of War 2, he could do on the PlayStation 3. That meant that we could immediately start designing stuff and immediately get in and start working on things." End quote. That's the exact mechanical flavor of the introduction. Every single thing you remember and enjoy about controlling Kratos and the frantic, ferocious gore of combat is the baseline, and then an upwards-moving conveyor belt of more. Just like how the Hydra was the real star of the show in the first level of God of War, it's a constantly rotating, hard-fought, strung-out battle of wills against the Leviathan that steals the show here. The Leviathan is like a fusion of crab, horse, spider, Gary Busey. It's weird, it's mean, and it is completely transfixing to look at. God of War isn't afraid to drag out the lengths of these fights, longer than might initially seem fun, but the thematic benefits of this far outweigh the costs. These are massive, impossible gods and monsters that have long been understood to be invincible. So these fights typically evolve through many different stages, ratcheting up the tension, the danger, the time investment, the personal investment, in a fight that's on some level as exhausting as it is exhilarating. The perseverance at play that Kratos has in the face of what's aligned against him is a key element of his character. Mirroring that, as the player, builds a lot of resonance. At the end of the introduction, you have killed not only the Leviathan, but Neptune himself. Neptune can barely believe it. Kratos never seems to have had any doubts. As Neptune dies, the seas swell and rage. Soon, the coastlines of Greece will all be drowned. All of this in the first hour of the game, which means, according to the rhythm established by God of War 2, it's time for a mechanical reset. Zeus strikes Kratos from the mountaintop, so Kratos falls all the way back to Hades itself, lands in the river Styx, and is stripped of his powers back to the bare minimum again. Kratos has now gone to Hades 4 times in 4 games, having been killed by the gods and sent down there 3 of those times. For now, novelty is done. You might have noticed something on the way down, though. This entire game world is one connected strand. The top of Mount Olympus to the depths of Hades are physically connected, a consistent set of levels. The high-definition Hades of God of War 3 just isn't quite as compelling, though, as the apocalyptically weird, bodies raining from the sky, flesh pillar puzzler of a Hades that God of War 1 portrayed. Also, the combat feels weak and slow compared to what the game started you off with, which is on point for how they want you to be experiencing Kratos in this moment of defeat. It's just a very rapid shift in mechanical rhythm. It'll be a while before you're back at god-killing strength, which is both a narrative and mechanical necessity. There has to be some kind of arc to those methods of interaction over the hours of the game, and using the climax as the introduction short-circuited the most obvious escalations for both. Post-reset, you're quite literally working your way from the bottom to the top of the mountain in a bloody journey of revenge. There's some bouncing back and forth later on, but it just reinforces what's so clever and satisfying about this completely interconnected world. Olympus, Mount Olympus, is a kind of gigantic, mythic machine, and breaking machines is something that Kratos is uniquely qualified to do. God of War 3 recognized that blurring the lines between dungeon and overworld was part of what's made the franchise so unique so far. The Temple on Kronos' back in God of War 1, the Island of Creation in God of War 2, single dungeons with multiple wings and interlocking parts that take hours to put into the right configuration to unveil the prize. God of War 3 escalated even that. The entire game functions in this way as wings of a singular mountain-sized dungeon. All the plot beats are designed to intensify that holistic feeling and allow a completionist approach to the game world. The first arc is quite direct, from the bottom to the top. Your god-killing powers that might have worked on Zeus have been snatched away, so you have to go back for Pandora's box all over again. Like the Hades sequence, it's kind of an aggravating repetition if you're doing all the games in order, but it also functions as a kind of greatest hits type of narrative, where you know a lot of your audience are coming in without having played the originals, and this does intensify their connection through the recycling of motifs that are proven crowd pleasers. The Pandora's box thing is cool, so we're gonna take it from the top, but with even more complications this time. The box is the game-long goal, but it's protected by a flame that kills anything it touches, so Kratos goes up the chain of minor gods on his way to Zeus, climbing the literal chain that holds Olympus, the mortal world, and the underworld in balance. First Hades, then Helios, Hermes, Hera, up and up and up and up, and from each god, Kratos will exact a price. In past games, magic was granted either by the gods or the Titans as a gift. In God of War 3, Kratos steals an ability from each god he encounters by ripping it from them over the course of a given deicide. It's a way for the game to distinguish itself from the previous titles in the series and from most other action games by way of the wild and excessive brutality of simply expanding your inventory. God of War's violence is certainly one of the most divisive things about the franchise as a whole, the way it indulges itself so much more than average and revels in the meanness of its violence in a way that's actually kind of uncommon. I've seen other game critics lament what it implies about the medium generally, that the murdering feels great is such a common statement of praise about so many different games. I totally agree that when you put it like that, it is a strange and maybe uncomfortable statement to make, but it's also one that I find myself leaning on and believing unironically. Video games, like any artistic medium, can be put to any purpose an artist can envision. There are many, many non-violent games, but violence in games can have a completely different texture and weight to it than you'll see in other mediums because of its interactivity and its artificiality. Some games might rely on a more heavy approach to what violence means. I still remember Telltale's Walking Dead Season 1, where you have the option of amputating your own main character's arm to try to slow down a zombie infection. It is super brutal, very gory, very violent, but it's meant to inspire sympathy, a human kind of feeling. Kratos' violence is simply the expression of power for power's sake, and that's the fundamental thrill of the whole underlying game design here. In real life, violence means something. Even in a narrative, if you've invested in the realness of that world, it has to mean something. But in a digital space, there's always a constant understanding of everything you see being, on some level, false, ephemeral. It takes skill and a lot of tonal finesse to make death feel serious in a game because with save points and respawns and the simple power of the new game button, nothing is permanent, death least of all. If you're doing traditional storytelling, this is a challenge to overcome, but if you're leaning into the peculiarities of the medium, then this is maybe more of an opportunity. Death and injury are a serious consequence of violence. Without those consequences, violence is an expression of power only, an assertion of will. If you're a sociopath, or something worse, then you don't care or actively desire the consequence part, the injury, the death. And that's what makes Kratos a villain, because he is all about that shit. It is his sole driving motivation at this point. Heartless, performative cruelty. The player, however, is probably not a sociopath, so why are we taking this journey with Kratos, and why is that fun? Well, I think it's because feeling powerful is a universal human thrill. In real life, we must temper power with compassion and respect. In play, is a little different. Even in otherwise sickly sweet TV sitcoms, characters become mustache-twirling tyrants the moment someone breaks out the Monopoly board. Or, for example, I am pretty positive that a raccoon would kick my dog's ass if she ever took one on for real, but the look that she gets in her eye when she gets her toy raccoon by the neck and shakes it until the stuffing is out and the toy is covered in spit and her little brain is scrambled from the ruckus, well, that look is goddamn infectious, so mischievous, so satisfied. God of War 3 is dark, nihilistic, and has a fundamental outlook that would be completely indefensible if it wasn't done out of dramatic exaggeration. So why is it instead an object of fun? Because God of War's 3 violence is not weighted. Its object is action and not consequence. Every time a god dies, the world deteriorates, and thus the narrative reintroduces consequences for those deaths that the narrative is interested in giving meaning to. This is a very small chunk of the violence in the game. The larger chunk of violence is a $44 million chew toy for humans. That sounds derisive. I do not mean it derisively. It takes a lot to break people from their composure, their busy adult selves. You're on this journey not out of real, true-to-your-character meanness and bloodlust, but because you got the toy in your mouth, you got the fire in your eyes, and sticking with Kratos means that you are absolutely going to get to see the stuffing come out. The synthesis of everything I've been talking about so far is plain to see in the descent into Tartarus for a boss fight with Kronos, on whose back you spent so much time earlier in the series. Even though Kratos was fundamentally on the Titan's side, Gaia told Kratos that this was their war, not his. This didn't sit well with Kratos, so he decides to kill them all and leave them unsorted where they lay. So, at the very bottom of the world is the Chamber of Hephaestus, where all game long there's a very large, very ornate door that's closed to you. It's designed to stick in your mind and make you itch to open it. It's a door to the deepest hell, where Kronos waits chained. The sub-basement of the whole mountain dungeon. Without the holistic design, that itch to see what's behind it wouldn't be there so strongly. In God of War 2, once you left somewhere behind, you really left it behind. Here, it's less certain. The door wouldn't be there if you couldn't open it. So how and when? This door is tied to narrative, but another door, the next door, is an active puzzle instead. It's not that difficult of a puzzle, but it sure is a good-looking one. God of War has continued the traditions of taking motifs from classical art and just turning them up to 11 in deliciously impossible ways. The door to Tartarus is a fine example. It opens onto a wave-based arena battle, and then the path winds to a scenic vista of tortured souls in this massive underground space. You fight all the way to Kronos, you argue with him, and your very first action of the boss fight is to resist being crushed between his fingers. How are you possibly supposed to kill this guy? There's genuinely no indication this early on in the fight. You just have to keep pushing until an opportunity reveals itself. In this instance, the head of Helios, which you personally tore off the sun god's body, can blind the Titan for a moment, letting you leap and run along his arms and shoulders where he swats at you like a fly. That is the scale of the fight. Man-sized Kronos versus fly-sized Kratos. The game has to go on, so your victory is in some sense inevitable, but the idea of it, the look of it, seems charismatically absurd. The fight goes on and on and on, alternating between QTEs where you leap from body part to body part, environmental hazards from his slapping hands, wave combat from the defenders who rally along his body like ants. He even swallows you whole, and you have to slide down his gullet quicker than his throat can push a lump of acidic bile toward you. It is every mode of combat and obstacle that the game knows in an unpredictable sequence where the level itself is alive, moving, and trying to kill you. Swallowing you is the fatal mistake. Kratos uses the Blade of Olympus to herniate his way out, and then climbs up to the old Titan's face and drives the sword down through the Titan's forehead, a slow and tiny needle, slowly turning off the immortal's lights one by one. It is uncompromisingly brutal and surprisingly sad. It's also breathlessly fun and rewarding. The interplay between disappointment with who Kratos is in the plot and delight in how Kratos feels as an avatar is part of what makes the game what it is. It tempers the mechanics and doesn't let them get away with it without at least some element of self-criticism. That self-criticism ends up only really extending to Kratos, though. Your triumph in killing something 100 times larger than you is still perfectly valid. This simultaneous celebration and rebuke is a fine, fine line to walk, which God of War 3 eventually does stumble and fall off like the beam-balancing puzzles of old. The problems all come around to Pandora, who serves as a completely counterproductive moral anchor for Kratos late in the game. She's the only one who can open the box, and that part's a hoot. One of the most memorably devious parts of the entire game is the labyrinth where she's hidden, a labyrinth of suspended boxes caught between Mount Olympus and the underworld. As a plot device like any other character, she could have skated by entirely without notice. Instead, they humanize Pandora more than any other character in the franchise up to this point, and then use her as a humanizing force on Kratos in the late game. The problem with this is that it causes a domino effect of recontextualization if we're going to believe Kratos has the capacity to care about her at all. That Pandora reminds Kratos of his lost daughter, I believe that. That's simple. But if he cares about her safety and personhood more deeply than that, why not others? Earlier, there was a very weird pairing of scenes in Poseidon's old chambers. Still lingering in the palace, Poseidon's busty and topless consort cries out for help and then recoils in fear when she sees that the help that's coming is Kratos. This is warranted. In the next 5 minutes, Kratos will force her to march through the dungeon, chain her to a door mechanism, and then allow her to be ripped in half by that same mechanism so that he can get through the locked door. This kind of thing isn't new for Kratos. You roasted that soldier alive in the first game, and then you threw another wounded soldier into a very similar gear mechanism in God of War 2, and you've always been able to kill non-combatants of either gender for health in ruthless ways. Sexualizing this particular scene with the nudity makes it uncomfortable for the player, but, it's not out of character for Kratos at this point. However, if he's able to be sympathetic to and protective of Pandora, why not this woman? She's hardly more than a half dozen years or so older than the kind of girl Pandora's made out to be. Pandora has to choose to sacrifice herself against Kratos' wishes to open the box. Kratos would have apparently chosen her over revenge. But this isn't a long game, so it's not more than 5 hours between ripping the one woman in half and having his fatherly side engaged by another. Once you've established that Kratos is capable of choosing differently, it prompts an examination of why he did not, and there aren't many good reasons why that aren't at least a little bit sexist. Add into this mix a scene that takes place not 15 minutes after the Gear Ground Girl, the infamous QuickTime event in Aphrodite's chambers. Aphrodite coos and flirts and spouts dialogue that sounds like old late-night Cinemax flicks. Even by the standards of 2010, her super sexy seductress dialogue feels not only juvenile, but also dated. I went into as much detail as I did on the sex bit in God of War 2 because it's useful to contrast it to how they did it here. There, it was a prank on the player, what with the peeing cherub and the outrageous circumstance of taking the time for a jacuzzi threesome mid-battle. Here, Kratos is a murder machine who's killed every other god in his path without discrimination, and yet Aphrodite is spending time cooing around about how long it's been since a real man entered her chambers. It's flattery directed towards an overwhelmingly 18 to 35 male audience at the direct expense of taking Kratos seriously, or at least taking him straightforwardly. During the cutscene, 2 other toga partiers give more over-the-top compliments to the point of collapsing off-camera from being just too turned on by the guy that's equally as likely to rip them in half. The joke in God of War 2 was that that particular minigame was trollishly stupid. You were a dumbass for playing it. Here, there is not a joke so much as just a campy doubling down on the stereotypically masculine ways that the game tries to make the player feel powerful in the first place. Except it's just dumber than shit. It's a sophomoric thing in a way that's extremely out of fashion, and hasn't been in fashion since Freddy Got Fingered was lighting up the silver screen. The thing is, it is honestly silly enough that I'm sitting on the couch pretending to beat up monsters. By overextending the compliment, by having these digital Grecian Valley girls tell me what a fabulous lover I am because I'm mashing the buttons as they pop on screen, it's hard not to feel self-conscious about how artificial the whole experience is. I'm not a mighty warrior, I'm a nerdy schlub in Eastern Oregon. I had been, happily transplanted into the world and its rhythms, and now I feel kind of coerced into going outside for the rest of the day to make up for having spent such a nice afternoon on something so self-indulgently frivolous. Try to tie all these threads together. Kratos doesn't value a woman who doesn't directly remind him of his own family. Even then, it's about him. He kills Pandora's actual father, Hephaestus, and never mentions that death to Pandora once. Kratos doesn't care if the matter at hand is fighting, or family, or fucking. It's all about what he can take and how powerful he is. Aphrodite's real man thing. I mean, when you look at all that together, it's mostly old-fashioned, straightforward sexism. What's strange is how none of it, from top to bottom, none of that was necessary. Kratos did not need to be humanized with a false daughter. He didn't need to be complimented by a softcore porn cliché. The game didn't need to blend its sex with its violence by crushing that girl in the gears. All Kratos needed, all he wanted, was blind revenge. They could have left that pure and simple, but by treating one woman in the supporting cast as real and human, they opened up their own Pandora's box of having to ask why the rest of the script's women are written in such contradictory fashions. The climax is a little convoluted because of all these late-game shifts in character. Rescuing Pandora is just about the last major part of dungeoneering in the game. All that's left to do is pop down to Hades, break the chain loose from the judges who hold it, as it was foreshadowed the first time you were down there and encountered all those tantalizing glowing crystals you couldn't quite smash yet. Using the gauntlets that you took from Hercules, you break the chains. Using the wings you stole from Icarus, you fly to the top of the suddenly unstable mountain. When you get to the top, it's time for the confrontation with the father of the gods and the father of Kratos that you've been waiting for. Sure, you kicked his ass last game, but this time it's personal, and/or for keeps. In keeping with the pulpy melodrama of the franchise so far, God of War 3 further gamifies the moment by putting Zeus and Kratos in a mostly two-dimensional arena with a fighting game camera angle. It's like the one and only action video game trope that they hadn't bothered to explore yet, and here they are, last 15 minutes of the last game in the primary trilogy, and they're slapping it in with a big old grin. Round 1, fight. You've just gotta admire the hubris of assuming that this would work, and then spending so much time and effort tuning the speed and methods of attack for Zeus and for Kratos that it actually does work. The pace of combat, the animations, the button mashing, it all mimics the frantic and heavy feel of an arcade beat-em-up. This is only phase 1 of the fight besides. Phase 2 goes outside and then shows you your own handiwork. Greece in ruins. Neptune's death caused floods and rain. Helios' death made it permanent night. Hermes and Hera's deaths unleashed plagues on the land. There is no conceivable argument that you've helped anyone or anything. Pure destruction, every direction. If you kill Zeus, then what? Kratos couldn't care less. After this arena fight, you're then scooped up by Gaia, and the fight continues to her heart. You stab Zeus and Gaia's heart in one blow, killing God and narrator in a wickedly efficient blow. I figured this was the end. It's the climax of all the arcs, certainly, the peak expression of mechanical power and dominance in the narrative, the terminal endpoint of Kratos' revenge. There doesn't need to be more, but there's more. Zeus somehow pulls Kratos down into a repeating vision of his worst moment, his family's death at his own hands. Of course, Kratos has done worse since then, but this is the only thing that he actually regrets. As Kratos faces the memory multiple times, he eventually lights a lantern with Pandora's flame and hears her voice. Pandora says that what was in the box, the power to kill a god, is hope. I mean, what? In the first game, it was the power to grow real big and hit the bad man with a large sword. You've been tearing gods to shreds and keeping the useful bits all game long. It's just altogether too much to throw in this redemptive strand now, at the very, very end. I suppose that it simply wouldn't fit anywhere else. Without the fight, Kratos is nothing. He's the fucking god of war. To stop doing war, he'd have to stop being a god. Which is what ultimately allows the climax to land, if awkwardly. With the powers of positive thinking, Kratos finishes off Zeus. Then what's left of Athena, whose role and motivations as a green ghost I admit I'm more or less completely stumped by, bickers with Kratos about what to do with hope, like hope is a trinket to be bartered for. It's kind of baffling. But Kratos' vision and choice at the end of the game are clear as day. He sees that this destruction was of his own making, from the very beginning, and that an end to this sort of war means an end to himself, that in becoming the god of war he had become what he most despised. So the last subject of his revenge is his own self. The whole thing about releasing hope back into the world, that's all a little too much bathos for a game like this. The thing about closing the loop of his own fatalistic extremism, right on the money. Kratos sees himself, he sees what he's done, and he lets go of his rage for the first time in the franchise. This is a difficult thing to believably pull off, given the truly relentless brutality of the game thus far, but in making this significant pivot after the climax the player was most anticipating, there's a surprising amount of tonal breathing room in which to do it. Kratos is now the dog who's caught the car, and he sits there dumbfounded amid the wreckage with a scrap of rubber in his mouth. The game has to pivot somewhere. Mercifully, though, it opts for additional closure over cheap cliffhangers. Its only concession to the further franchise is a brief post-credits moment that shows Kratos' body missing with a trail of blood going off-screen. Would there be more God of War? Absolutely. But the series would move backwards for a few years before it would leap forward again the same way God of War 3 did. The next significant title was another PSP campaign, released just 8 months later. Where God of War 3 was focused on wrapping up its internal plot threads, Ghost of Sparta is probably the most prolific borrower of myths, motifs, and images in the original series. It starts you off, for example, on the way to Atlantis. Atlantis is easily the most famous myth otherwise untouched by God of War, and holy shit does the game do it upright. Ghost of Sparta is widely recognized as being one of the most graphics-intensive games ever released on the PlayStation Portable, coming late in the handheld's popularity. Chains of Olympus had already pushed the hardware, but that experience meant Ready at Dawn knew what margins of power and spectacle were still left to be pushed, and how to push them. Ghost of Sparta is an altogether much more impressive production than Chains of Olympus, closer in art and spirit to God of War 2 than to the other PSP game. The only problem is that, in spite of being just about as good-looking a game as it's technically possible to make for the system it was designed for, it is a de-escalation for the franchise for the first time in release order. After seeing what the PlayStation 3 can do, the life and movement in the level design, the massive scale of its connected world dungeon, going back to an optimized PSP world, even if it's 25% larger than Chains of Olympus, is still a much smaller, less dynamic world than last time around. In a certain way, it was wise to move backwards in the timeline, too. God of War 3 was a very final finale, so Ghost of Sparta slots in right between God of War 1 and God of War 2, after achieving godhood, but before the Spartan attack on Rhodes. It concerns a plot thread that the very first game included in kind of a roundabout, obscure way. There's an achievement in God of War 1 that you get if you watch a post-game cinematic in the Treasures menu. That treasure talks about Kratos' long-dead brother Deimos, how there was a prophecy that the Painted Warrior would bring the Pantheon down and destroy Greece one day. The gods thought that it was Deimos that killed them, and so they killed him. They chose poorly. Anyway, the cutscene makes it seem that the next God of War is going to be about Deimos. God of War 2 went in a completely different direction, but taking that old dangling thread and building it out into this particular slot in the timeline means that in narrative order, this is indeed a direct sequel to God of War 1. It even fleshes out the motivations and justifications Kratos has for going rogue so soon after being introduced to the Pantheon as one of them. It's a really wonderful link in the chain in the franchise's high camp narrative, but a significant portion of the enjoyment of Ghost of Sparta depends on where in the chain you place the link. There are lots of different orders to play these games in, and some of them I think are much better than others. For example, this video is arranged in release order. I think it's easiest to see how one game builds off of another and how the whole picture of Kratos' adventure is slowly penciled in if you do look at it that way. You could also do it by trilogy, where you do 1, 2, 3, and then Ascension, Chains of Olympus, and Ghost of Sparta. Neither of those orders are as satisfying to actually experience as going in kind of a modified narrative order. I think it's important that you start with God of War 1. It's the most coherent introduction to the whole experience, to Kratos' character, to the world, to the feel of it, and if you can get through its puzzles and traps, then everything else will be downhill. Next, do both PSP games at once, one after the other. Together, they're the length of a main game and serve as a kind of before and after story for the original God of War. Then play 2, then immediately play 3, and finally, you can add in Ascension if you want to as kind of a bonus experience. I think this maximizes the sense of escalation that's so key to the series and lets all the different foreshadowings play out in a more or less functional order. The PSP games aren't just spin-offs like so many mobile games are, like how Fallout Shelter is to the Fallout franchise. They're ambitious and full-blooded titles that fit in perfectly with the rest of the primary games. The thing is that once you've played God of War 3, it feels limiting to go backwards. Having a choice about play order can really alleviate that. Still, Ghost of Sparta does its best to follow up an act more technically complex than it's literally able to be. Ghost of Sparta isn't just an in-between chapter, it's got a very in-between kind of characterization of Kratos as well. It leans into the world-destroying, bringer of mayhem Kratos much more than Chains of Olympus ever did. Atlantis is a thriving city when you arrive, but by the time an hour and a half to 2 hours or so have passed and your fight with a boss monster in the bowels of the island's volcano reach a conclusion, the city is on fire and sinking into the ocean. Now there's the Kratos we know and love, fucking it up for everybody. The game even does its thing of foreshadowing with a big old locked door, knowing that you'd be wondering how you were supposed to get back to it with the whole city having tumbled to the bottom of the ocean. As a prequel with a mission to humanize Kratos, Chains of Olympus had all the fluidity and blood of the original game, but not that much of the extreme brutality of Kratos in the sequels. Ghost of Sparta leans much more heavily into the later, meaner Kratos, creating more uniquely memorable moments and boss fights in the game than Chains of Olympus was able to manage because of it. Take King Midas, for example. There's no particular need for him to be there, but like God of War 2, Ghost of Sparta is content to just sort of pull a myth out of a hat and then set you immediately to beating the shit out of them. To get across a lava stream, Kratos tracks the guy down, drags him kicking and screaming to the molten river, tosses him into it, and turns the whole thing gold, killing the old king and opening the path forward most spectacularly. It's gory, it's meaner than shit, it's surprising, it's everything that a good mythological murder was in God of War 3. The Fall of Atlantis is also a fantastic way to carry over the apocalyptic tones and motifs of that game without being very related to it in narrative. Ghost of Sparta is as masterful an execution of the style, mechanical texture, and ambitious level design that makes the God of War games what they are, as the PSP system can manage. It's just that style and mechanical texture have started to move beyond novelty and beyond fascination to the less active engagements of familiarity and comfort. Ghost of Sparta is more God of War. It's good God of War, and in a certain way that's good enough. But it also exposes the limits of the franchise now that the whole bubble of what's possible in the setting is nearly filled in. Even the sex minigame is desperate to prove that it hasn't lost its shock value. They seem to have figured that if they can't match the digital quality of high-resolution Aphrodite, they'll go for quantity and have Kratos bang out a dozen women at once. I wish I was kidding, but at least we've swapped from the eye-rollingly self-congratulatory to the broadly comedic again. They just keep adding 2 more women, and then 2 more, and then 2 more, as if there was a short, balding coach with a baseball cap and a whistle just out of frame, demanding to see some hustle and good sportsmanship out on the field today. The way that this scene is included is also indicative of a cry for relevancy and for attention. Kratos visits his home of Sparta for the first time in the series this game. That should be a really big deal for him as a character. There's some flavor dialogue and a small amount of world building, but probably a full quarter of the Sparta experience is immediately running into this brothel where Kratos wordlessly picks 2 girls up, carries them through the building, and then orders up the rest. In God of War 1 and 2, this side of the game was less critical to the overall franchise branding. The first time, they kinda hit it by assuming that the player might not hop up on the bed to find it in the first place. The second game, they put a screen up there that he had to break down. It was really surprising to find it there. Here, it's a big neon sign that says, "Hey, we remember how much you like the tits. Have a whole egg crate's worth." The monster designs have begun to edge further and further into B-movie nudity too, always a franchise signature, but not yet quite so prolific as here. Having lost their ability to escalate in the story, to escalate in the level design, and to escalate in the game feel, they're escalating the only way they can, into the salacious abyss of unrepentant Grindhouse Camp. The undisputed king of Grecian camp isn't Clash of the Titans, it's the 2006 adaptation of Frank Miller's 300. God of War 1 came out before that movie did, and subsequent God of Wars have largely avoided referencing it too directly. Not so with Ghost of Sparta. Here, the entire plot is largely a riff on the opening bit about how the process of weeding out the weak and training boys to be killing machines ensures that only the strong, only the hard survive. He and Deimos helped each other navigate the brutality of those early life trials. It's another sort of family that was taken from Kratos, the family of brotherhood and kinship. But it has been 30 years since the Wolf in the Winter Cold, so Kratos has to go all the way to Tartarus to get him. So that's, 5 out of 5 games for going to hell and back, but who's counting? Early on, you get the Spartan Spear and Shield, which proved to be an invaluable help mechanically. Its design, though, is identical to the film props. It's a reference more than it is a mechanical choice. And then, when you get to Sparta, the primary thing you do there is hunt down a dissenter, a Spartan who believes that Ares is the rightful god of war and Kratos is just a usurper. Kratos calmly and rationally convinces the dissenter of the warrants of his claim. Or would if curb-stomping the guy wasn't so much easier and simpler and more satisfying, right? Killing innocents is part of what Kratos does at this stage in his arc, but again, juxtaposition and context matter. Your homecoming to Sparta is 1/3 sexing up half the town in one go, 1/3 remembering when you were young and also very good at fighting, and the last 1/3 is murdering the shit out of the one guy in town who doesn't recognize your authority. Together, it's all just extremely tired old alpha male cliches writ large one more time. Kratos is the elephant seal, large enough to crush his rivals and maintain his harem. Big man, very cool, him fuck, him fight. I still maintain that the God of War games are actually quite artistically complicated works with a lot going on, but the things that give people the impression that these games are juvenile works for middle school boys aren't hard to find. They're right on the surface, and things like the reductively stereotypical portrayal of Spartan values and masculine strength. Kratos is most interesting when the game is most skeptical of him, when he's embodying the extremes of rage and obsession and being a weird, scary son of a bitch. Kratos beats up gods. This random dude with a bone to pick with him ought to be beneath his notice, don't you think? We don't need to further establish that Kratos is not to be trifled with. We're pretty past that by now. Besides, we also already know how the story will end. No one's mentioned his brother Deimos again for a reason. But the overall arc is good, and there are some fun moments between Kratos and Deimos in the last 45 minutes or so that they have with each other. At the very beginning, Deimos attacks Kratos. He's blamed Kratos for so much, for so long, and that resentment bubbles over into a boss fight. Yet, quite uncharacteristically, Kratos forgives it, gives his brother the arms of Sparta, and then you set off to kill Thanatos together, as brothers. It's fun and engaging enough, but the climax is one area where Chains of Olympus actually is superior. There, the sympathetic villain and the whole bit with Calliope felt fresh and personal to the series. This climax is grasping at whatever narrative straws are yet unpicked. That's why play order is so important for God of War if you're going through them. If you play Ghost of Sparta early on, it's easier to write that stuff off and bounce immediately off of it into the superior God of War 2. If you play it as the 5th game in a row, you not only get the distinct impression that you've almost completely run out of mythic figures to kill in the Greek pantheon, but also that Kratos is just stuck in a loop of himself. In God of War 3, Hermes taunted him, "Kratos, off on a fool's errand again. Never learn, never change." Kratos ends up ripping that guy's legs off for the insult without ever quite considering if what Hermes was saying didn't have some major validity to it after all. 2013's God of War Ascension is widely regarded as the franchise's low point, and in many ways that's true. If God of War 3 portrayed the most extreme possible length that Kratos could go to as a character and his terminal endpoint in that arena, Ascension was the most extreme length and terminal endpoint for Kratos as a consumer product. Without completely reinventing the man and his circumstances by giving in to the common wisdom that sequels must deliver more of the same, Ascension has very, very few directions left to explore. It's a wadded root system in a too small pot. It has nothing to do but to run snaky coils around the places it's already been. It's a game that is trying to be something new for the franchise in small degrees, fits and starts of innovation that aren't enough to change a player's perception of what God of War is fundamentally, but are enough to disrupt the comfort and nostalgia that people were expecting from yet another iteration of angry Greek Gallagher and the Watermelon Museum. The thing is, the game is kind of unfairly maligned in this way. There are things about it that are awkward and weak compared to its predecessors, but there are also plenty of other things that are tremendously creative and act as meaningful extensions of the kind of design work that made God of War 3 such a true classic. The proof of concept is playing right in the opening level, which is actually my second favorite opener in the franchise after God of War 3. Ascension is, technically, the earliest story of Kratos in the franchise, and a side plot where he has to defeat the three ancient Furies in order to be able to, eventually, for some reason, make a move against Ares. Functionally, they're just the Fates all over again, with new costumes and new themes. God of War 3's intro was, itself, a long-awaited climax. Ascension doesn't have any such hook, so it starts with visually arresting schlock and keeps building out along those lines. It's something like Return of the Living Dead 3, where the baseline of production is still pretty decent and the crew are obviously having a lot of fun, except everyone clearly knows there's nowhere for the story to go but into a sinkhole of escalating shock value. You've seen zombies, yeah, but what about a zombie girlfriend with glass in her breasts? On one level, no, I haven't seen that yet. On another level, it's clear I had not seen that yet because the franchise hadn't yet been so desperate to be memorable in some way, anyway, even if that way eternally condemns it to 2 a.m. reruns on the Sci-Fi Channel. So, God of War Ascension begins with Kratos being chained up by a weird insect lady who yells about how she'll teach him manners and respect, and it couldn't have been more schlocky if they got John Waters to guest direct the scene. The level that follows, however, is even weirder, even wilder, even more active in the way the architecture shifts around than the opening level of God of War 3. You're in a temple built inside the tortured, half-dead body of the Hecatonchrates, a titan with, according to myth, many arms and many heads. The Fury you're fighting has these crazy powers of infection and infestation. She turns the Titan's flesh, the ground on which the entire level is based, into a seething riot of gangrenous, angry, living hatred, all directed solely towards Kratos. The Titan even rips off bits of buildings that are stuck to him while you're in them, forcing you to move from floor to wall to ceiling, while continuing to fight whatever monsters you've been fighting before. The art is great, the level design is delightful, but the tone has moved beyond self-indulgence to kitchen sink sensationalism, because that's the only way left that it can still try to top itself. The order of levels and their construction are technically held together by an overarching plot, but what the game experientially is feels more like 3 discrete large dungeon vignettes woven together. They're all good dungeons, too, sometimes excellent dungeons. The technical skill and polish that's always been with the franchise is here, too. The way extra chests are hidden, the slow unlocking of bars, and the powering up of inventory items, it's all the same as it ever was, for better or for worse. The quality of the experience hangs more on its differences than its similarities to previous titles, unfortunately for Ascension. Once the knockout opening level is done, you find yourself in a flashback, within a flashback, within a prologue, which is about the lowest possible dramatic stakes a person can have. Ascension came 3 years after God of War 3, nearly 2.5 after Ghost of Sparta, and its relevancy in the larger gaming sphere was waning fast. God of War 3's climax was so climactic that it kinda scratched the whole itch for Kratos and his eternal quest of revenge. Here, we're circling back around to the very beginning of the story again. And then, even within that timeline, we're jumping around in an order that's much more complementary to the level design than to any narrative strength. Strong dungeons are a major part of what's enjoyable about a God of War game, but they're not alone in holding the whole production up. They're joined in competence by the art and the puzzles. Still, if all the puzzles, the levels, the art, are evocative of God of War's better self, for the most part, why do people hate the game? Don't all those things provide the nostalgic, reflexive satisfactions the longtime fans would turn to the game to provide? I figure none of those things are quite enough if the combat doesn't feel right, and the combat has been reconfigured enough to have significant textural differences compared to the previous titles. The fundamental basis of combat is still swinging around them nasty old chains, but the chains now operate on elemental damage principles with magic tied to the highest upgrade tier of each elemental type. Which is to say, you use magic a whole lot less, and you swap between colors on your blades a whole lot more. Unlike before, where only brutal kills using quicktime events gave back green and blue orbs, here different elemental damages cause different pinata effects on death. They also affect your speed, your range of attack. It's a way to more or less force a player to use secondary weapons by making the secondary weapons modes of your primary attack. In previous games, a lot of effort was made giving the player exotic weapons other than the blades. And while some were certainly fun, none of them felt or looked as amazing and satisfying as the good old Blades of Chaos. It's like the Lancer in Gears of War. They made such an iconic weapon the first time that it made people skeptical and disinterested in having their attention diverted by the shinier, newer weapons later on. Comfort loops work that way. Well-worn grooves of consistent expectation and consistent reward. If I get a hamburger at McDonald's that tastes noticeably different from what I think it's going to taste like, my first reaction is going to be, this is weird, this is wrong, before I even evaluate if, perhaps, it's actually better or worse. All I know is that it's contrary, and now I am suspicious. The elemental variants of the Blades of Chaos, once you get used to them, mix up the rhythm of combat and do make things more controllably strategic. You can choose what orbs you want back, you can tailor your attack speed and your secondary effects to enemy type, rather than the earlier approach of spamming magic and mashing buttons. It is a refinement, genuinely, truly, but it is a refinement that feels different from the system that players have already mastered in a way that negates that mastery. It doesn't matter what the blind taste tests say. People didn't and don't want a new Coke. Not being tied to any sort of coherent storyline means that the dungeons can go absolutely nuts with their own private gimmicks, though. I strongly suspect that the dungeons came before the script in the development process, but I couldn't find anything to corroborate that. They're just so creative in ways that stand in real contrast to the exhausted tropes of the script. The Hecatoncrates is one, but there's also a vast temple whose wings can only be extended and made accessible by attaching 3 ancient mechanical snakes to a rotating tower. It's been centuries since the mechanism was used. The snakes are all deteriorating, but they still coil and curve from mountain to mountain. One part of the level, a whole 10 or 15 minute bit, is trying to ride the snake as it goes, fighting foes, ducking obstacles. It's just such a cool image and such a great use of the lax laws of video game architecture. The snakes defy physics, but tickle the imagination. Just the right balance of over-the-top spectacle that's made God of War's maximized museum motifs so iconic. Weirdly, Ascension introduces a small game mechanic that runs counter enough to player expectations to be really genuinely novel, even this late in the game. An amulet that manipulates objects through time, decaying them with age or healing them by reversing it. As a puzzle mechanic, this means that Kratos rebuilds more than he destroys for the first time in the franchise. It may be little more than a gimmick, a la a similar mechanic in the similarly ignored Red Faction Armageddon, but here it's a mechanic more interactive with the player's understanding of Kratos than the environment itself. This is the very same Atlantis-sinking, Greece-destroying, Pantheon-murdering man-mountain he has always been. His story and his fate are fixed. It's the player who benefits from this sudden burst of constructiveness. It completely changes the way you envision a path forward in the dungeons, not necessarily looking for the walls that you can break down, but the staircases you can build back up. This is what makes the Temple of Apollo, roughly the latter quarter of the game, so uniquely enjoyable. Its position in the plot and the elaborate scale of the dungeon put it on par with the temple on Kronos' back in the very first game. But the temple is utterly shattered when you arrive. By the time you leave, it's gleaming and pristine, a marble colossus bigger even than Kronos and his stone backpack. It evokes the sense of wonder and scale that the older games did by letting you approach it in a way that's creatively contrary to your expectations of how the level design is supposed to work. 6 games deep, a player's expectations are deeply worn in. Plus, by this point in the game, you've also likely rounded out your magic list too, which lets the game's combat, finally, reach its most stylish, frenetic rhythms. Hiding those spells was meant to reduce dependency on them, but lack of a variety of satisfying area of effect attacks and the lack of the visual variety of so many spell effects as you used to have dulls the pace and look of combat for hours and hours in the early dungeons. Again, it has dulled these edges to force the player into actually being strategic, but strategy takes away from the primacy of impulse and anger as drivers of the combat pacing. There's always been some strategy needed, but here it is different. I didn't even realize I was playing the most notorious part of the game until it was over, and I did not capture footage of the experience because I was too busy banging my head against it over and over again, thinking that I was the one who was being clumsy. The Trial of Archimedes is a 3-wave climactic challenge wherein the first wave is cruel and difficult in a way that the games haven't really indulged since the first title. It's like a puzzle in that there's really only one valid solution, not a particular weapon or a particular combo, but a rhythm of combat that the game seems to feel is more or less ideal. The solution is, deceptively, simple. Always be carving up them snake ladies. That's it. In detail, though, the brutal kill system has been somewhat reworked to be more interactive. The idea is that more regular creatures should have mini-boss fight-like extended quick-time events to emphasize their danger and intensify the gore of the kill. While doing these quick-time events, you're immune to other damage sources. So the trial pits you against something like 30 consecutive Medusa-like snake ladies, 4 or 5 at a time. All of them have the ability to instantly kill you by turning you to stone, and also have an opportunity to try to do this during the roughly 30-second QuickTime event it takes to kill them and release their sweet, sweet orbs. The way through is to use magic to critically damage all the snake ladies at once, then methodically refund your magic with a brutal kill system. If you spend any medium or definitely large amount of time in between kills, you'll certainly be overwhelmed. Always be Carven. If you falter in the rhythm or accidentally let yourself get turned to stone in any of the 24 repetitions of the same QuickTime event, you begin at the beginning. It took me about 2 hours to do it. Probably over an hour of it was spent repeating this one particular QuickTime event over and over and over, from snake to snake. I hated it. It was awful, it was boring, so I did not hit the record button and just sat there in numb frustration until I finally cinched it. Part of the problem is that they removed a franchise stable, which is where if you die over and over in the same spot, the game will offer you easy mode. Nearly every game I began on normal and then waited until I was completely infuriated with the fucking game to bump it down. Ascension locks you in at the difficulty you choose at the start menu. No going back. The higher the difficulty, the more hair-pulling the Trial of Archimedes is, from what I've read from other reviewers. On normal, it was as bad as anything in God of War 1, but not actually appreciably worse. It has a clear solution. It's just a get-it-right-the-first-time solution, like in the old days. The conclusion moves backwards in time towards nostalgia for the first game in more ways than that, even. The whole finale is an invocation of that first level against the Hydra on the Wine-Dark Sea. You fight against the deadly illusion of some sort of Leviathan on the deck of a ship being pulled into a whirlpool. Why? Because it's really fucking cool looking. That's why. Like most of the game's best moments, it stands on its own, disconnected from the whole. I'm fascinated, though, by the placement of this particular callback at this particular moment. It's like a tacit, climactic admission that the franchise is now chasing its own tail, that Kratos will never be more than he once was when we were first introduced to him back on the deck of that ship. We have gone a long, long way, only to wind up right here back at the beginning again. Kratos had the right of it at the end of God of War 3. If he ever wanted to be anything other than a hateful figure trapped in a loop of his own rage, he would have to let go of his anger and let go of himself. The player would have to let go of the reflexively nostalgic desire for God of War to offer more of the same, its well-worn rhythms of triangle, triangle, square, and colored chests. There was nothing left to learn. Nowhere left to go. To save the franchise, nothing less than complete reinvention would do. 2018's reboot of the franchise, simply titled God of War Again, has come to be regarded as one of the greatest game experiences you could have on the PlayStation 4. I want to begin by saying that this is true. I've never played anything quite like it. It's a beautiful game, visually, structurally, and most surprisingly of all, emotionally, with Kratos still as the protagonist. The opening is unlike anything else the franchise has tried yet, not because it's escalated anything, because it's uncharacteristically quiet. Kratos is chopping down a tree. A boy is there. His boy, it seems. Kratos is much, much older. They're chopping down this tree to build a funeral pyre for the boy's mother. The woods are cold and mysterious, and somewhere deep within them, the boy feels a change. A hugely different journey than God of War has ever gone on before is about to begin, and you too can feel that change coming from somewhere deep in the forest, long before the full shape of it becomes clear. It's hard to know where even to begin, but if we start with the differences first, then I think the similarities become more meaningful. For while this game is a reboot in many ways, perhaps even most ways, it functions as a direct sequel much better and more actively than I ever imagined it would. It's one of the most thoughtfully constructed action games I've ever had the joy of playing, with a design that's both picky and confident about precisely what kind of an experience it wants to be and how to do it. I had considered playing only the reboot when I first got a console because its reputation was sterling, and the earlier games had this popular conception as being the jock jams of third-person action. But I wouldn't have been nearly as invested in and moved by the game if I hadn't seen Kratos at his darkest and meanest. Even in the first 90 seconds of the game, we're doing completely different methods of storytelling than the franchise has tried before. Kratos has this moment where the bandages he has wrapped around his forearms, where the chains used to be, slip and dangle in a way that's reminiscent of those old weapons. He looks down at them with a weary sadness that tells the audience so much of what he's become in the time in between games. He's tried to let go, but he can't. He's scarred, permanently, as indelible as the ash of his first family still clinging to his skin. So much of how the new God of War is the way it is happened on account of Cory Barlog, the lead animator of the first game, director of the second and third, and more broadly the franchise's creative caretaker. He had to fight to make it about Kratos. Nearly everyone else was as skeptical as I was that Kratos would function again as a protagonist. In a June 2019 interview with Eurogamer, he said, quote, "Early in discussion, people were saying we had to get rid of Kratos. It was like, he's annoying, he's done. They really did not like the character, they wanted a new character. It took a lot of convincing to make them think it was a good idea." End quote. It took Barlog even more convincing to add the boy, the moral anchor of the whole game. Atreus' presence now seems so critical, but at the time there were many conflicting, contradictory ideas about what God of War was about as a franchise, who Kratos was as a character, and what could be done to make him more than what he was. None of these almosts and might-have-beens are apparent in the game. The game stands as solid, immovable, and confident as the Ghost of Sparta himself. The quietness of the intro intensifies the mystery of it all so much more at the beginning. To begin with the same energy as the franchise used to have and the same immediate boss fight would indicate that this is the same old Kratos. But no, here he is, no blades, a child, cutting down a tree and taking it by canoe back to his house. He's still a god, that much is clear from how he puts the whole trunk on his shoulder like it ain't no thing. Beyond that, though, who is this Kratos? What has he seen? What has he learned since we last saw him? What has he unlearned? He is quiet, stoic as always. The player has nothing to do but paddle the canoe and sit with the questions. In a massive interview with VentureBeat, Barlog talked about how important this construction of the opening moments was to him. Quote, "In the previous games, we were all about that first 10 minutes with a big giant creature. It was great, but it was also really hard. By the time we got to God of War 3, you ended up in this arms race. It's big, but it's not as big as that other one. You're always comparing it to the previous one and going thumbs up or thumbs down. We couldn't do that anymore. We had to throw that arms race out. We had to focus in on what's interesting." End quote. The new God of War is easily 4 times as large and lengthy of a game world as the previous ones, in terms of both physical space and plot, yet it's these first 20 minutes that allow the game yet to come to flow as easily and wonderfully as it does. The insistent minimalism of the moment lets us see, firsthand, in the human ways of looks and gestures that comprise the screen presence of the digital actor, that Kratos is different. Can you imagine a narrator in a cutscene, "It has been 20 years since mighty Zeus has fallen," all that kind of regulation issue video game exposition, starting with answers before you even know what questions to ask? The new God of War starts with inference instead of exposition, a whole different kind of storytelling for a whole different kind of Kratos. Even more critically, his basic physicality has changed massively, the texture of how Kratos feels to control and move around the map. The first, biggest, most immediate of those changes is the elimination of the jump. Forget double jumping, forget single jumping. Here it's just mantling and climbing. Consider for a moment how many puzzle designs from the original series that would be completely invalidated if you remove jumping. 80%? 90%? Knowing in the first 5 minutes that jumping, beam balancing, all the other player dexterity-driven content simply won't be there this time is a huge revelation. The domino effect touches the puzzles, the level design, the pacing, even the way the player looks at the world around them. The puzzles, necessarily then, are no longer quite so tied to reflex and timing as they used to be. They require a cerebral solution that you arrive at from curiosity and exploration. The level design secrets have to rely much more on locked doors and intricacy of architecture than they do on fixed camera perspective and death-defying leaps. Deaths from falling off the map have been almost completely eliminated from the play experience, and those deaths were probably more than half of the total game over screens I've gotten in games past. Eliminating all those resets focuses much more on the skill of combat and places the primary threat to your mortality squarely in that arena. Once you've gotten used to it, you see the map with these limitations in mind. The logics and the patterns that you've used to sniff out traps and chests before simply don't apply anymore. New game, new rules, new rhythms. And all of this stemming from one single change to movement. Taking out the jump was like taking out a piece of who Kratos is. The marvel is how much of an appendectomy it actually was, the removal of something that was once important, but no longer has very much relevance to who he is now. In 6 games, Kratos has never been without his swinging chain blades. They've got different names depending on where in the franchise you're at, but the blades are arguably much more critical to who Kratos is than jumping ever was. They are the most iconic part of the previous games, and animating those chain blades is some of the first work Barlog ever did on the franchise, back when he was the lead animator for the original title. He knows, better than anyone, how inseparable the two are, and in that knowing realized that the blades had to go if we were going to accept that Kratos had changed. Instead, Kratos carries his wife's axe instead. It's magically enchanted to return like a boomerang after being thrown and can stick in wood objects and some other surfaces for use in puzzle solving. The Blades of Chaos were a medium-range crowd control weapon. The Leviathan axe is a one-at-a-time weapon with close and long-range functions. Rhythmically, they are worlds apart. The axe is better suited to the new heaviness of how Kratos moves, where the chains were more meaningful and useful when he was more dexterous as a character. Plus, the axe is much of the very little we learn about the boy's mother. She's never seen, there are no flashbacks. Her presence here is in the quest, and the axe, and the boy. Before the opening of the game, she had some last requests. One was that they cut down the trees that she had marked, trees that, when felled, would break the spell of protection from the outside world that had kept her, Kratos, and Atreus hidden for so long. 2 was that they take her ashes to the tallest mountain in the realms. The new God of War takes on an entirely new mythology, Norse mythology, and does a much more faithful and wide-angle telling of it than they ever did with the Grecian pantheon in the earlier titles. A lot of that has to do with framing differences. Kratos was shoehorned in among them, and the gods there deformed to make room for him back when it was the Greek pantheon. Here, he's an outsider, more even than Atreus. The switch from melodrama to character-driven drama shone a light on an interesting nugget of truth from the last games, that despite the many, many cutscenes devoted to how wrought up he was about having killed his first family, Kratos wasn't much there for them when they were alive either. He was always off doing war. He may have wandered a world away, he may have given up his blades, but none of that much prepared him for what it meant to put in the everyday work of loving a family. So he did what he knew. He provided for them well, but he was always off, doing war. It was the mother that raised Atreus on the myths and legends of the world. This leads to a fascinating and wonderful dynamic in the journey where Kratos is the protector, but Atreus is really the guide. Kratos doesn't care much for stories, and one of the best running gags later on is his utter inability to tell a good story. The player does, though, and so does Atreus. Story sponges, the two of us both. Besides, Kratos cares quite deeply for the boy, so he listens, and he learns. And that chance to listen and learn is extended to the audience as well. Atreus is full of stories, but no practical knowledge. Both characters go in as blind as the audience does, but from the very beginning, a major part of developing the two and their relationship is through the myths and legends that they encounter, the telling of them, the trying to make sense of them. We know what Kratos knows, how to kill, how to loot, how to progress. Atreus teaches us both so much more about the world than that. When we finally meet Mimir and add his chatty, decapitated head to the party, Mimir provides even broader context and understanding, a depth of knowledge that the boy can sink his questions into. That was part of why the mother's last request was what it was, to force her family to grow without her there to tend to them. Destiny and myth play another part in that choice, but her legacy in the game is present in every moment through the stories that Atreus tells and the axe on Kratos' back. She must have been quite a warrior to earn Kratos' respect and wield such a weapon. She must have been quite a parent to instill such curiosity in the boy. And she must have been both visionary and devious to send them on a journey that seems so simple in the beginning, yet snowballs into events that shake the supernatural foundations of the Norse. My favorite meme about the game is the Photoshop of the cover that changes the title to Dad of Boy, since that is so much more about what the game is about now. Shouldn't this necessarily contradict what the franchise is supposed to be, who Kratos is? And if all you're doing is asking that question, it seems like, you know what, maybe it does. Playing the new God of War, however, shows that the game is asking the same question and then giving a very long answer. The thing Kratos fears most, more than any monster, any god, is telling Atreus who he is and what he's done. That fear is the cause of much of the distance between them at the start of the game. And it's a correct fear on some level. There comes a point where there is no hiding the past from the boy. He just has to hope that the kid's grown enough to know what to do with the knowledge. This manifests very early on in a really remarkable scene, the first boss fight of the game. Kratos is teaching Atreus to hunt, and then they chase the stag into the clearing where a giant troll attacks. It's the first time that the combat has escalated to the scale of previous games, and it feels very much like coming home for the series. There's even a return of the QuickTime events that make a boss's death so satisfyingly brutal and crunchy. Afterwards, Atreus runs to the troll and stabs it over and over again, yelling in rage and triumph, completely lost in the kill. It makes Kratos incredibly sad. He takes the boy's bow, and he tells him that he is not ready. That same rage did Kratos no true favors, and here's that rage in the boy. This is the experience that we, the player, want and expect from a God of War title. The yelling and the stabbing and the stabbing and the yelling. And here's Kratos, the undisputed heavyweight champion of yelling and stabbing, looking so sad and so tired and so disappointed in that behavior. This tells me much more about the in-between years from God of War 3 until now than any nugget of lore or backstory could. It's amazing in how genuinely faithful the game is to who we know Kratos to be. As much as the whole bit about hope irritated me with the schmaltz of its presentation, I liked who Kratos was in the final cutscene of God of War 3. Who he was there, and who he is here, are clearly 2 points on the same line of Kratos' story. His attitude, his gruffness, even if the voice actor swapped from T.C. Carson to Christopher Judge, he still seems like exactly the kind of utterly utilitarian, brutally stubborn person he's always been, where even a polite response has a low growl trailing from it. Putting that guy into a parental context, couldn't that just come off as goofy, a la Hulk Hogan starring in Mr. Nanny? Or couldn't it come off as nasty, a washed-up murderer yelling at his kid for hours on end? How did they balance it so well? Trial and error, apparently. Again, from that VentureBeat interview, quote, "We were just trying to find the voice of Kratos, but man, people hated it with a passion, on the team. Our first 7 goes at it. One person wrote a really long email to us saying that this game felt like a child abuse simulator because we were trying to find Kratos. We didn't want him to be too soft, but it turned out he was way too mean. Then we overcorrected, and we had someone else read the temp dialogue. They said, he sounds like Qui-Gon Jinn. He's so calm. This is terrible. The needle kept going back and forth until we honed in on it. There it is. It was almost the same dialogue. That's the interesting part. Moving things around, cutting things down, shading a few bits, and also finding the right read so that it doesn't feel angry all the time. For a good 6 to 8 months, people said it was depressing to play our game because Kratos is such a jerk. They hated him. Alright, that's not good. We wanted it to feel true to Kratos, but it can't be that hardcore." End quote. The earlier God of Wars were games of extremes and impulse. How brutal can the protagonist be? How large can these monsters be? How far can these motifs be pushed before they fucking snap? This God of War is a game of moderation, temperance, thoughtfulness. It's a kick-ass action game, too. Don't think for a moment it's not. The thoughtfulness comes in because the balance of its elements is intensely delicate. Much more delicate than it appears at first glance. There are so many ways it could have thrown itself off balance, but didn't. It was a hell of a puzzle. But I guess it wouldn't really be God of War if it wasn't one they had to get right in a single go or die. The absolute perfect encapsulation of what's so special about their dynamic is the scene where Kratos finally screws up the courage to tell the boy that he was a god, and that the boy is a god as well. It has been weighing in his mind for years. His voice strains to put the words together. It's harder for him than killing that fucking dragon was. And how does Atreus respond? Atreus asks if that means he can turn into an animal? It flummoxes Kratos. It is the perfect thing for a kid to focus on, and not even in the same universe as the kind of questions that Kratos was expecting. For Kratos, this information is loaded with decades of memory and regret. For Atreus, it's a matter of wide-open curiosity. They don't understand each other, but they have so much to teach each other. Kratos knows the weight of the thing. Atreus knows the freedom of it. The truth is very much in the middle. As the game goes on, and godhood sits longer on Atreus' shoulders, he becomes kind of a little shit about it. He's got a darkness in him that reflects the darkness around them on their journey. He's learning that power gets you what you want, and gods are unaccountable to their power. It is the exact opposite of what Kratos wants to teach, but it is exactly how Kratos used to be in the old games. Atreus is learning these things because Kratos won't be honest with the boy about what damage those perspectives did to him. Early on, Atreus asks him, "But you only killed bad people, right?" Kratos sits on that question for some heavy seconds and then says, "Yes." Maybe he believes that's true and that he felt no one was without badness in them, but it is a cruel deflection of the real question here. Had he told Atreus no and admitted that he was wrong, it would have stood as a warning. By saying yes, the boy becomes more convinced of his qualification to judge the worthy from the unworthy. This builds and builds to the point where Atreus is shouting at one of his only real friends, the dwarf smith Sindri, that his little person problems are beneath their notice and to just shut up already. It's a little shocking. The boy is really changing, and not for the better. He keeps going downhill until a confrontation with the Norse god Modi. Modi insults the boy's mother, and the boy kills him for it. He does exactly the kind of impulsive, vicious thing that Kratos has done time and time again, like when Kratos strangled Hera in her gardens for the sin of calling Pandora a whore. Kratos doesn't quite know what to do. He's more ineffectual in this moment than I've ever seen him before in the entire franchise. The boy wonders why Kratos cares. A kill is a kill. Modi was an antagonist. Kratos replies that they kill for survival, not as an indulgence. I love that phrasing because it's so directly referencing all the revenge that came before. None of that was survival. It was all indulgence. And it took from Kratos his family, his country, and eventually his world to make those indulgences. He insists that there are consequences to killing a god. He knows it, the audience knows it, but he's still too afraid to elaborate to Atreus. So long as all that remains vague for the boy, it holds no power. It's only in Helheim itself, the land of the dead, where a vision of Zeus appears, a ghostly replay of Kratos pounding his face in over and over and over again. Kratos was, like Perseus, like the children of Leda the Swan Lady, born of Zeus and a mortal woman. Atreus is witnessing where this attitude leads if you let it reach its extreme terminal fruition. Beating your fucking dad to death 2 games in a row. Atreus begins to soften again after this, but the boy's darkness festers because Kratos is too fearful to shine a light on it. He'd gone and done a cat's in the cradle. The boy was just like him, and that's not what either of them wanted. When Atreus is mortally injured, Kratos realizes that he'll have to dip back into the person he once was to overcome the obstacles in his way. The cure for the boy is in frozen Helheim. The ice-tipped Leviathan axe is no good for the task. So more than halfway through the game, long after I had made my peace with only having the axe as a weapon, Kratos returns to his home to get the Blades of Chaos from a hiding place under the rug. A storm rages as Kratos paddles a special canoe path just for the occasion. The air is absolutely electric with trepidation as Kratos lets the memories, the guilt, and the unbridled power come flowing back into him. Athena's ghost even makes an appearance, as condemnatory and cryptic as she was in the third game, looking identical to how she was in the old game as well. I had been thoroughly lulled into thinking that Kratos had left it all behind, but no, his old ghosts were right under the floorboards the whole time. It's such an incredible moment. In post-mortem interviews, the developers talked about how tricky it was not to say anything about it either, not in any kind of preview or in response to any kind of curious question about it. Tonally, texturally, Kratos needed to be divested of the blades for all the changes to movement and combat and mood to work. Even the control schemes had changed. If you give the players the blades, they're going to want their button combos, their triangle, triangle, square. It's a whole linked chain of expectation. By this point, you've spent at least a dozen, or more likely 24 hours with Kratos, how he feels now, who he is now, and then this turn of plot brings him spiraling back to this whole legacy in a storm the colors of winter and blood. When Kratos felt like this, when Kratos fought like this, he was a villain. Now he's something different. Now he kills to survive, not out of indulgence. The axe and its single-enemy rhythms force a playstyle that's much more conservative and strategic than the previous games. The majority of special attacks are selected from a list, 2 at a time, a heavy and a light, called runic attacks. They're the main sort of magic you get, a hybrid of combo and spell. They add options, but combat is more a series of choices than the button masher it once was. Blades of Chaos, bless 'em, have been completely unchanged in look and feel from previous titles. They're still a mid-range crowd control weapon that causes whirlwinds of indiscriminate damage. All the old combo moves are then slowly added back into the roster as runic attacks. Now, Kratos is both his past and present self, and much the stronger for it. His shame is chained to his wrist, but it's a burden that he'll carry if it can save the boy. For all the serious matter it is to Kratos, getting the blades back is a huge delight as a player. The expansion in a player's crowd control capabilities means that the game can now throw many, many more enemies at you at once. They can throw elemental enemies at you, 2 strains to suit 2 weapons. They can build resonance with the franchise by reintroducing animations and methods of attack that have been part of a finely honed, deeply grooved trench of positive reinforcement for 6 games running. There's a great moment when Kratos and Atreus are adventuring in a treasure hoard with a big spinning blade trap. Solving a small optional puzzle yields a chest. "Wow, how do you know that was there?" the boy asks. "Experience," Kratos curtly replies. This buzzed me up laughing because that was indeed exactly how I found it. By this point, I am reflexively conditioned to go down any and all hallways that run contrary to the direction I'm supposed to go. If this was my first God of War game, I might have been surprised by the chest too. I was way, way past that. I knew it must be there. That's how it works. That's the dungeon deal. Kratos knows too. That's the old resonance between Kratos and the player, the shared drive to the fight, the nearly invisible line between game feel and characterization. All of that is still here. Yet in starting with the new and slowly emulsifying the old back into it, the sense of context and the sense of meaning is much more complete. The feel of the new old Kratos and the old young Kratos, swappable at the touch of a button. Just don't ask him to jump. One thing Barlog is very proud of about the game, and others have called out as being really remarkable, is the fact that it is a single camera shot from beginning to end. It never fades to black or looks away. It doesn't pan out and provide a cinematic vista the way that it used to with a fixed perspective. In theory, this provides a more intimate feel. Personally, I think it has less actual impact on the game experience than it might have if they hadn't also included such a complex and fiddly inventory system. The straightforward upgrade trees of the old games, slow at first and then increasingly rapid in contrast to other progression systems, are replaced by a buying-selling crafting system with dozens on dozens of crafting materials and many more sorts of objects than you'll ever actually use. Brock and Sindri, the squabbling dwarf brothers who run the shops, are absolutely fantastic supporting characters, so I'm hesitant to say that the game would actually be better off without these features, but the amount of time you spend in menus is much larger than ever before, and inventory management, swapping runic attacks and enchantments and such, is such a frequent occurrence that there's no conceivable way you're not interrupting the camera for it at the outside every 15 minutes or so. What's more significant than if this is a perceptible choice for the game's camera work is how the game necessarily has to be designed to accommodate a one-shot methodology. No loading screens. Each area must be tied to the previous by a linear present tense path. No other tenses than present, in fact. No flashbacks, no flash forwards. No elaborate cutscenes for expository dialogue. If a person tells a story, you watch them form the mouth words to tell it. If something happens, it happens right up close and personal. A lot of times, that something can be fatal. Even if deaths from falling off the map are eliminated, the fact that death resets you to the last checkpoint further degrades the single-shot camera trick as experientially meaningful. It's those cascade effects from the single-shot trick that you really feel. Take the puzzle design. So much used to rely on the camera alone, and how the fluid but director-driven camera perspectives hid portions of the map in the older God of Wars. Now you can turn and explore all which ways, so the primary driver of the puzzles has turned to looking carefully for hidden environmental detail, hidden runes or alternate lines of sight to throw your axe at a trigger item, and away from just sort of mentally projecting what out-of-frame space a room might have. There is no more out-of-frame. It's a whole different way of looking at the map. As you go along, certain abilities like the fire damage of the Blades of Chaos or lightning damage for the boy's bow allow you to solve different types of puzzles. Many of these puzzles are nested inside one another. So if you unlock one part of the dungeon, it may reveal a sort of puzzle you're unable to solve yet, a sly reminder to come back later. In this way, you actually pass by chests full of stuff for the Blades of Chaos early on. It's tantalizing, but not yet time. The same feeling provoked by the big iron door in Hephaestus' chambers back in God of War 3. In fact, it's the level design of the whole overworld, the interconnected, loading screen-free map, that ties the new God of War to the old games even more than the Blades of Chaos. Earlier, I had called it a world dungeon. The developers now call it wide linear. This is one of the few areas where the new God of War actively escalates on an element of the original run of games. Wide linear certainly describes the ambition behind the primary trilogy, and each progressive game has widened that linearity even further. The first game is traditional linear, but its interconnected world and the scale of its main dungeons are meant to give you the illusion that it's not. It's a straight line twisted into a dense wad of knots that you gradually untie. God of War 2 is similar, but its outdoor focus and the cohesiveness of the Island of Creation expand the impression of how large the world is. You tour everything you see, even features that appear in the extreme distance of the skyboxes at first. God of War 3's Connected Olympus didn't have nearly the volume of optional content as the new God of War, but the scope of the game-long whole mountain dungeon is on par with the impression of scale that the new game leaves. What makes the new approach to wide linear so wide is that something like half the game world of the new God of War is optional. Without being able to hide things with the camera, the game simply hides them in the vastness of its space instead. God of War operates otherwise on the same world dungeon principle as the first, a giant outdoor space called the Lake of Nine that forms a slowly unlocking hub from which all other content branches off in wings. How is this different from an open world? Well, in an open world, activities are usually discrete tasks and points of interest on the map. The Lake of Nine's areas are overlapping and completely interconnected. The larger side quests open up their own wings of the dungeon, a new and compact region of the world, but the side quest is hardly all you do there. Each region is a spiderweb of hidden chests and locked doors. Room by room, dungeon-style progression is the primary mode of engagement, not the more staccato rhythm of travel activity scavenge travel that characterize a more regular open-world game. You play the game in the same navigational mode that you played God of War 3, with the expectation of being able to 100% the given content. No hallway exists randomly or for flavor. Everything is purposeful. The way the game slowly unlocks the lake is unforgettable. Jormungandr, the world serpent, lies coiled in the lake. The first time you arrive, you disturb him and he moves towards the hills. This drops the water level and lets you access a good half-dozen optional areas arrayed around the main temple. Later, you summon Jormungandr for a brief conversation. The World Serpent is on a scale much larger than any other monster yet portrayed in the franchise, and making interactions with it friendly further move the new God of War away from the old God of War. There's a sense of wonder here, of being in the presence of something majestic and bizarre. A game of all monsters can never be completely faithful to the myths behind them. There has to be room for wonder. There needs to be more flexibility for connecting to the story. With the Greek pantheon, it was easier to get away with because the franchise was exaggerating elements that were already very much in the original myths. The Norse myths are stranger. You hear a wide variety of them, from Mimir, from the story cabinets scattered across the dungeon wings, from the mythic figures themselves. These stories are the fabric of the world that you inhabit. So when Jormungandr recognizes you and gives you an audience, the world turns, the lake drains out another 30 feet or so, as the serpent uncoils and the waters flow out. Now, another half-dozen areas open up, and completely new portions of the previous half-dozen areas open up as well. The new and the old are interconnected by winding paths. The lower paths allow newfound access to higher parts of the map that were previously closed to you. An open world suggests a space that exists on some level independently of the player. Not so for God of War. There's beauty and magic around every corner, but no corner exists that isn't in some way meant to be used by the player. There is no real interstitial space besides the canoe rides, which provide a lull for more storytelling and character development through dialogue. They're welcome for that reason. And even then, you're often paddling over something that later becomes relevant and useful anyway. The Temple of Tyr in the center of the lake isn't just a hub and an anchor for the world's content. It's a combination lock that opens up other worlds entirely. Some of the world dungeon's wings are set in other realms, the plot-driven realms of Helheim, Elfheim, and Jotunheim, along with the optional game mode realms of Niflheim and Muspelheim. The temple will rotate its massive bridge to connect to a door in Asgard, the main world. Then the temple will displace itself into the same configuration in a different realm. It's a cool effect, but what's notable about it is that it's at will and not strictly plot-driven. You can return to any of these realms after you've been there to sniff out their undiscovered secrets. Each of them has rooms and segments that aren't accessible until you return with something from one of the other realms, some item or ability. Again, it's that recursive interconnectedness that makes the game wide linear and not open world. It's too dense and too deliberate to be primarily about player freedom. Choice is not the driver. It's about depth in the content you're given on the linear path. The Lake of Nine is a massive space, but it's a singular, connected space with all its optional content referring back to the main path. Or take the optional realms. Doesn't having this travel power make it an open world? Well, the way these realms are constructed is that they're more like bonus modes of play than plot-driven worlds. Muspelheim, the Realm of Fire, is a series of combat challenges that stack in difficulty. They're much more artificial in presentation than anything else in the game, with listed victory conditions, start-stop replay options, and automatic chest rewards. So you can come here and test your mettle and mastery of the game's various weapons and abilities in a really cool environment of fire and ash for the straightforward purpose of practice and fun. It's an arcade mode with a more or less completely linear progression. Niflheim is even more difficult and unexpected. Narratively, it's the realm of fog and the location of a mythic workshop. Structurally, it's a randomly generated labyrinth that you grind for special rewards. The labyrinth has something like 9 rooms, all with a different random enemy cluster to fight. The spaces connecting these rooms have a randomly chosen trap, from huge spinning blades to crushing walls. The chests inside are full of mist echoes instead of loot, and the fog is corrosive, so it acts as a timer for when you're in the maze. Exceed the timer, or die and lose your missed echoes. Get back to a starting position within the limit, and use them to unlock powerful items and dangerous boss fights. Niflheim is another arcade mode, but its purpose is much more nostalgic than mechanical. This is a very difficult, completely unrealistic, high-risk, high-reward environment. Like the old dungeons. The traps, the fights, the chests are really only there for people who want a pure dungeon experience. No plot, no myths. If you're a player who likes a context and a reason for your actions, you can skip Niflheim entirely. You can never set foot in it if you don't want to. It really doesn't matter to the game at all. But if you're a player who plays God of War for how Kratos feels to control, for the moment-to-moment of play, this is the most traditionalist design in the entire game. It's most reminiscent of who and how Kratos used to be, what with the broader design intention of the series. They've taken a whole playstyle and structural attitude and made an optional area of the game out of it. Then there are the Valkyries, a whole class of optional boss fights that press the player's skills harder than anything else in the main game. Each optional realm incorporates a Valkyrie fight. In the main world, they're tucked away in the hidden chambers of Odin. The fights are brutal even if you adjust down the difficulty, which you can do any time now, and even adjust the difficulty back up afterwards if you like. The Valkyries are so much faster than Kratos. Keeping up with them demands the same level of total, button-smashing commitment as the most hectic combat of the older titles. Some of the fights are really intended to be epilogue content anyway, tackled after the journey is complete and Kratos comes home with the boy. This depth of optional content is the width in wide linear. It's the impulse that separates it from an open world. I don't really usually ever try to 100% an open world game. There's too much to see. There's too little reason to see all of it. Here, the collectibles and activities aren't frivolous or discrete, but full-bodied features and modes of a game that has more or less perfect clarity about what makes God of War feel like God of War. So then, have we arrived at the long answer to the simple question of whether Dad of Boy fundamentally contradicts God of War's feel and intention? Mechanically, I think we have. The game's been well and truly rebooted, rebuilt from the ground up with new combat rhythms, inputs, and game feel. Now that the rebuilding is done, however, the action and the scale of the game is as over-the-top and bombastic as it ever was. The slow start was just a slow start. By the end, Kratos feels as powerful as ever, while simultaneously being truly likable in a human way for the first time in the whole damn franchise. At the beginning, this did not seem possible to me. What the game accomplishes is beyond the imaginative scope of the old God of War titles. But it's never too late to grow and learn new ways of being. One of the most memorable moments of the game for me is when Atreus and Mimir tell Kratos the story of Tyr, the Norse God of War. Tyr is long dead in the game's timeline, yet his legacy remains. Judicious compassion, respect for knowledge and self-expression, love for the world, and protectiveness of it. Kratos thought he knew what being God of War meant, since he learned so well every lesson that Ares had to teach. Tyr's path is completely divergent. Where people spoke of Kratos with terror, they speak of Tyr with heartfelt respect. Where Kratos was destructive, Tyr was constructive. The Temple of the Nine, the clockwork structure at the intersection of realms and the center of the game world, was built according to Tyr's vision and needs. Kratos, fearless as a warrior, has been hiding from what his godhood means, terrified of what it means for the boy, because his understanding is limited by his experience. There are other ways to be the god of war beyond an eternity of blood and hate. Of course, the optimism at work here was fatal for Tyr. Neither extreme can work forever. There has to be moderation. Hope tempered with realism. Fatalism tempered with imagination. Even if done out of love, an extreme choice can be incredibly damaging. That's how we end up with Baldur, our villain. Freya, his mother, has been helping Kratos and Atreus all game long. She is the first one to tell Kratos he needs to come clean with the boy, the first one that Kratos turns to when Atreus is badly hurt. Freya is likely the most compassionate character in the entire franchise, a person who's experienced intense hardship and cruelty but refuses to let that darkness take her with it. She's as powerful a witch as Kratos is a powerful warrior. She took that power, and she cast a spell on her son, that he should never die or feel pain. This was a choice informed by all the pain that she'd gone through herself. The gods are terrible. She wanted to spare him that, like Kratos wishes to spare the boy his own burden of godhood. The spell ruined Baldur, utterly. He ceased to feel anything at all, and became a sneering, snarling thing. One of the main reasons that he seeks out Kratos is because Kratos, at least, is a fun fight. All the awful things that Odin had done to Freya, that was the kind of person Baldur was becoming now, like how Atreus was becoming when he killed out of indulgence. Baldur hates Freya. The confrontation between the two of them at the climax is as verbally brutal as any QuickTime event was traditionally brutal. Freya is the best of them, and she failed her child by trying to spare him from a life that she knew would be painful. Baldur will not forgive Freya. He won't leave well enough alone with Kratos. The showdown is dozens of hours in the making, but it is tonally so different from any boss fight that came before this, because it isn't narratively what anyone except for Baldur wants. Baldur is forcing things to violence, forcing things to extremes like Kratos once did. Freya's role in the fight is to animate the corpse of a dead giant and use it to try to separate the combatants. The mixed feelings of inevitability and regret evoke the end of God of War 3, evoke the Kratos he used to be. It's the Kratos he still is in times like this, as far as he's run from it. He breaks the spell, he kills Baldur, he kills Freya's boy. It's impossible to feel good about the outcome of the fight, because from this day forward, Freya is an enemy for life towards the two of them. If the situations were reversed, Kratos wouldn't let it rest either. He ruined all of Greece the last time someone took a child from him. What extremes will Freya go to if she chooses to indulge her darkness and pain? When God of War began as a franchise back in 2005, it used the fallibility of the gods as a sensationalistic hook, their pettiness and their short-sightedness writ large across an operatic plot. It never much went beyond caricature. The new God of War treats its myths with a lot more depth. They begin in the same position, figuring that the fallibility of the old pantheons are what's most likable about them, but the new game shows the gods sympathy for the first time, and that makes a world of difference. Freya may very well be the next game's antagonist, and if that happens, I will not blame her a bit. It's such a funny thing that a game franchise defined by its excess and heartlessness would come to feature one of the most emotionally believable games I've ever encountered. It's particularly strange when you consider that it's a franchise that's been in the same hands and guided by the same artists pretty much the whole time. It is not an example of a new developer with a new approach swooping in a la the Machine Games Wolfensteins. It is the same developers honing their sensibilities over time. It feels especially human because it's incorporated how the humans behind it have changed into the game itself. David Jaffe has this remarkable and depressing quote about the personal toll that making the original game took on him back in 2005, telling Edge magazine, quote, "It was a huge job. I gained 40 pounds on this game. I did irrevocable damage to my marriage. It was a stressful experience. It was a hostile environment. Part of that is what led to God of War being as successful as it was, but it was a real challenge," end quote. Barlog was there too, putting in the same hours, and then again on God of War 2, and again on God of War 3, and again on the 2018 God of War. Barlog has a son too, and he's spoken in interviews about how a large volume of the anxieties that Kratos has, a big portion of the strain in the relationship between him and Atreus, is based directly on the impact that his work life had on his own relationship with his real-life son. Barlog said to The Guardian, quote, "So much of it reflects our relationship and my desires. I would love to go on an adventure with Hilo. I hope that he would want to, that we wouldn't have this awkward relationship that unfortunately we have right now, because it works so much. Because Kratos wasn't around in Atreus' early years, Atreus interprets that as, you don't love me, you don't want to spend time with me. It's obvious that I don't live up to your expectations. I'm trying to be better for my son, and regretting every moment that I'm not spending with him." End quote. Barlog goes on to say, quote, "Years before, I felt like I was creating the same game over and over again. We didn't know the audience would be open to these things. The audience now is more open to storytelling that tries to hit a note other than awesome." End quote. The distance between the first God of War and the most recent is no more than 13 years. Yet, look at the incredible distance the franchise has covered. Its aesthetic and art has developed across 3 console generations. The games began during an era where awesome was everything because the shape of what video games were even capable of saying and doing was so much more raw and undefined. The relentless escalation of the franchise from game to game to game, the way it pushed each system to its limits from PS2 to PSP to PS3, was a big part of the efforts to find those boundaries. It kept pushing and pushing until enough time had passed that the medium's more basic definitions were better understood. The undiscovered country wasn't in how big of a monster you could put on screen anymore. The real frontier was in using all that technical power to make something beautiful. When you think about how long movies have been around and how much has changed in 100 years, it's still a slow progression compared to the speed with which games have expanded and evolved as a medium. The new God of War is less of a departure from the old ones than I had been led to believe. Like Kratos, it's trying to be better. Yet, some of the things that I loved most about it were the things that connected it back to its original lineage, parts of the design that made it feel connected to the whole arc of past and present game design. When Kratos and Atreus reach Jotunheim, the long-lost realm of the giants, Kratos unwraps his bandages for the first time. The scars from his chains are sickly underneath. There is none of the weary sadness with which he regarded the bandages in the first moments of the game. He lets them blow away in the wind. Atreus asks him what he's doing. He says, "Now I have nothing to hide." Even if our past selves make our present selves uncomfortable, we are not our whole selves without them. We learn just as well from our mistakes as our successes, and we learn best of all with honesty about which is which. The new God of War is a game about radical change, about wanting to be better so you can pass down something better. It's also a game about fighting big monsters with chains and an axe. It had to perfect the latter to arrive so well at the former. If this is the extent of the change over the course of just 13 years, what do you suppose the next 13 will bring? No one can say. Just have to try your best to pass down the right lessons. Thanks for watching. This video and all the videos I do are supported through the crowdfunding website Patreon. I'd like to take a moment to thank by name the people who are currently donating $10 a month or more to keep these projects rolling. People like Alex Hansen, Zachary Ziemba, Leo Neal, Zach Millington, Tyler Robinson, Dirk Warbrule, Brandon Boat, Edward Clayton Andrews, Josh Dewey, David Carlson, Alex Williams, Comfy Hat, Eddie Burton, Carol Henderson, Nick Cole Hamilton, Jake Mays, Eli Bergmass, Morgan Mall, Kumaran Vishyan, Lars Braken, Thunder O'Brien, Jared Myers, Kevin Schaub, Tim Dobbs, Peter Flint, Jeremy McQuaid, William Heather, Ryan Snyder, Gabriel Holland, Matthew Sutton, Nobody, Low Beyonder, Matthew Mason, Galak, Sean, Brian McLaughlin, Jacob Siegelman, Ron Gervais, Ethan Cassick, Soe Sheik, Lucas Killigowski, Corey Bofill, Dennis Clark, World War II Freak, Alexander Leister, Igor Babiuk, Brian Hill, Agnew, Andreas Larson, Anthony Bardil, Asbjorn Volkivalian, Vance Jordan Falls, Ian Glascock, Dana Stupkjær, Lars Ingvar Andersen, Manu Wiedmann, yep, Aaron Albach, Toad Hart, Elijah King, Oscar Langström, Stephen Wong, Alexander Romanov, Cold Beans, Hercules Johnson, Pipe Man, Sean Weber, Benjamin, Robot Ghost, Medal of Connor, Ralph Rainwater, Linus Newman, Jeffrey E. Flannery, John Tchaikovsky, Kim Winson, Max Barnes, Tinfoil Pancakes, Travis Houston, Tom Painter, Makoum Saeed Al Maktoum, James Gray, Sebastian Pironi, Well-Tempered Clavier, Ben Bullard, April, Sasha Ayat, Adam Howard, Jesse Wilkison, Peter Radusky, Juju Beans, Sai, S. Ingvall, Quaynin, Andre Bregeger, Greg Mirles, Valerie, Elijah Nelson, me, Cobra, Leighton Carden, Tyler, Tizar Vakarian, Jacob McMillan, Dominic Carlin, Max Cohen, Deeb, Oscar Stangenberg, Jan Hendrik Hansen, Jared A. Hicks, Will Dobbins, Patrick McGranahan, Tyler F., Gillison, Andrew Opplinger, Squidlore, Cale Perrion, Noble Gamer, Maurice Dessereau, Jacob Green, Lawrence Hurley, Mr. Flacco, Leo Perrill, Kyle Zahner, Stephen Lovedance, Phil Harden, Philip Coffey, Highland Fox, Conceited Axis, Andrew Boyceville, Dragon Cobalt, Jacob Wanish, Trivium Art History, Sam Belnair, Jamie Andrews, Gordon Graham, Alex Nikiforov, Nikolai, Mike Dubs, Tiernan Garces, Pascal Moret, Matthew Richard Tubner, Ryan Van Dyke, Michael A. Kuhlman, Nemo Vandenbrink, Patrick Galmont, Jeanette N., Sovin Von Barrow, Pandaroo, Stephen Garrett Day, Alex Zalato, Callum T.M., Daniel Floyd, David Jonas, Owen Tierla, Ricky Shields, James Henderson, Aiden McCabe, Joaquin Coleman, Devin Fitzpatrick, Krimgi Schlepaps. I'm sorry, if Krimgi Schlepaps is your given name, I don't mean to laugh at it. It's just, that's a good one. That's a fine name. I really enjoy Schlepaps. All right, Max Pantoja, Stephen Heim, Vitor T.T. Martins, Lucas Yonderboy, Simon Anderson, Michael Atwell, Ian Goodrow, Sellewick, Soul James, Eric Joyner, Micah Shalom Kesselman, Baxter Jr., Derek Melancon, Serial Lane, Shields Wall, Colin, Pyotr Kasperzik, Adam Noguera Hayden, William Tung, El Weasel, Kissa, Werner O. Herzog, Simon Nearflow, Jordan Klein, Eric Amundsen, Markalev, Kira X, Sharif Gazenin, Arc D'Angelo, there we are, David Harpstrait, Brett Galmo, Ivan Ekeber, Daniel Orn Christensen, Rich Stover, Yazan Barghouti, Spooky Space Kook, Angus Swift, Stephen Francisco Santana, Victor Felton, Mark Phillips, William O. Gorman, Draley 789, Eric Jensen, Daniel Mower Meyer, Alex B., Byron Callan, Mikhail Aristotle, Dakian Delamast, Jared Olszewski, Thomas Whitty, J.S., S.G. Response, Colin Bassett, Zach B., Matthew Shriak, Mr. Pigeon, I Cannot Fly, sounds like a letter there, Franz Pattison, Matthew Cassidy, Simon Hasselhoff, Britton Gilbert, Roland Gray, Free Morphine, Marcin Zerov, Lode Galax, Sky Jansen, Hans Shipin, Andre Komole, Zachary M. Willits, Regret, Andrew Tapp, Daniel Phillips, Abdul Rahman Al-Absi, Alexander Sundu, Brian, Connor McLeod, Psycho Delicat, Tom Browerdick, Aurelian, Jeffrey McIntyre, Austin Matheson, Carl Gleason, C.E. Keene, Jeremy Saunders, Patrick Mills, Mario Mendez, Jonathan Holder, Robert Mitchum, Thomas Lee,
Kyle Zimes, Gregory the Bittersteeple, Nicholas, John Warlton, Lord Mordeck, Ethan Hayes, Quinn Hannah White, Peter Itt, Reese Kittleson, Janice, Tim Marsh, James Mosca, Tyrone Lambert, Colin Boutie, Garrett Johnson, Cybot D, Danny Kilpatrick, Noah Kentrowitz, Fergus Foley, Nate Tenzar, Lasselis, Zachary Bernhardt, Eric Jepson, Dylan Ball, Jordan Baker, Dave, Alexander Clatworthy, Vadim Flax, Kashira, I think it's pronounced, Colin Stoltz, Mizko Siaga, that's a tough one, Mieszko with the last name of CZAJA. Please send me an email to tell me how to pronounce that properly. Quinn Maxfield, Marcus Aurelius, Howard Knudsen, Carew Howells, Mr. Mush, John Little, Daniel Barsh, Oliver Ashton, Scrub Lord, and Darren Jackson, as well as everybody else who donates a lesser amount. It's this sort of stuff that pays the bills and keeps these videos possible, so I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you very much for supporting the channel.